There is a garage in Rick Sanchez's memory that flickers between two different versions of itself, and for years the series would not tell us which one was true. In one, his wife is laughing about something, alive, ordinary. In the other, a bomb goes off and there's nothing left standing. Rick told a federal interrogator that the second version was fabricated, and he was lying, though it would take 4 more seasons for that lie to finally surface. That is the kind of mystery Rick and Morty specializes in. A question gets buried under a joke or a monster of the week, and then, sometimes years later, it quietly gets paid off. I am glad you are here at Papertown tonight because we are going through every one of them, the ones the writers eventually answered and the ones they have said, on the record, they will never answer at all. So get comfortable. We will be here a while, and if you are here to drift off, this suits the format perfectly. If you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. Rick and Morty premiered on Adult Swim in December of 2013, created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon, and it has spent the years since burying real emotional information under jokes about interdimensional cable and testicle monsters. That combination is why its mysteries work differently than mysteries in most other television. A mystery box drama plants a question and dangles it in front of you. Rick and Morty plants a question, lets you forget you ever asked it, and then answers it 3 years later in a scene that is over almost before it starts. Some of what follows tonight got resolved exactly that way, without any fanfare, buried in a season premiere or the closing minutes of a finale. Some of it never got resolved at all, and more than that, the people who write it have said outright that certain questions are never going to be answered, that the not knowing is the actual point. And some of what people online insist is true is only a theory, something fans built out of a few suggestive frames and have repeated to each other for so long it starts to sound like something the series actually said. I am going to be careful about which is which tonight. When something is confirmed on screen, I will tell you plainly, with the episode it happened in. When something is my own reading of what a scene means, I will say so because that is interpretation, not fact. And Rick and Morty rewards you for holding those two things apart. And when something is just a theory floating around fan forums, I will call it that and nothing more because inventing certainty where the series offers none is the one thing I refuse to do to you. Rick and Morty is now many years and many seasons deep, and along the way, the two people who voiced its leads for the first 6 seasons stopped being part of it. Justin Roiland was let go by the studio in early 2023, after a domestic violence charge from a few years earlier became public. Those particular charges were later dropped, and separate allegations were reported afterward. He has not done any voice work on the series since season 6. In the season since, Rick has been voiced by Ian Cardoni and Morty by Harry Belden, and if you have watched the recent run, you already know the transition is remarkably seamless, which is its own quiet achievement nobody talks about enough. There's also an anime spin-off produced by a Japanese studio that tells its own alternate story and does not touch anything in the Mothership series. And there is Solar Opposites, which happens to share a creator and is not Rick and Morty at all. Comics and games sit further out still, generally treated as supplementary rather than binding on whatever the show itself decides to do. None of that is where tonight's mysteries live. They live inside the actual episodes, in the gaps the writers left on purpose, and the ones they eventually decided to close. We are moving through this roughly in the order Rick and Morty built it, one mystery at a time, rather than ranking them by how big or how shocking each one is, because the order these reveals actually arrived and matters almost as much as what they turned out to mean. A ranked list would ask you to decide right now which of these counts for most. Tonight is not asking that of you. The biggest of those gaps starts with the garage, so let us go back to it. For the first 2 seasons of Rick and Morty, nobody watching had any real reason to doubt that Rick Sanchez was exactly who he appeared to be. A genius, alcoholic grandfather who moved in with his daughter's family and dragged her son along on interdimensional errands. It was funny and cruel and strange, and underneath the strangeness there was a quieter suggestion that something in Rick's past explained the cruelty, though nothing had been confirmed yet. Then, in the 6th episode of the first season, Rick Potion number 9, it did something that would not fully make sense for years. Rick, trying to fix a love potion he gave Morty, spirals through failed solution after failed solution until the entire population of Earth mutates into monstrous twisted creatures, the kind of grotesque transformation fans still call Cronenberg after the director whose body horror it resembles. With their own world destroyed, Rick and Morty do not stay and face what they caused. They flee into a parallel dimension, nearly identical to their own, where the local versions of Rick and Morty happen to have just died. And without a word to anyone in that household, without their new Beth or new Jerry or new Summer ever finding out, the two of them simply step into the empty space and go on living. Sit with that for a second, because it is an unsettling thing to drop into the 6th episode of a cartoon otherwise about intergalactic pawn shops and testicle-headed aliens. The family we watch for the rest of the series, the Beth and Summer that Morty grows up alongside, are not, strictly speaking, the same Beth and Summer whose lives this Rick and this Morty originally belonged to. They are doubles, replacements in the most literal sense, occupying the exact spot where a nearly identical family used to be. The fan wiki refers to this as the replacement dimension and gives it a designation separate from the one usually attached to Rick's home universe, which several later episodes call C-137. That C-137 label gets used for the ordinary, everyday Rick we watch every week, and yet if the wiki's numbering holds, that everyday universe is technically the replacement one, not Rick's original. It is a genuinely unresolved inconsistency, one the writers have never cleanly reconciled, and it is worth naming rather than papering over. Some episodes seem to use the C-137 designation loosely, as shorthand for the main universe rather than a precise numbered address, and fans still argue about whether that is sloppiness or intent. I am not going to pretend there is a tidy answer, because there is not one on screen. What matters more than the numbering is what Rick Potion number 9 establishes almost in passing as a working rule of this universe. The Rick and the family you are watching might not be the originals. That single idea sits underneath almost everything the series does with Rick's backstory, and it took years to pay off. The next real piece of the puzzle arrives in the premiere of Season 3, The Rick Shank Rickdemption, which aired in April of 2017 after an unusually long gap between seasons. Rick is a prisoner of the Galactic Federation, and at one point an agent scans his brain and pulls a memory out in front of us. It is a domestic scene, warm and unremarkable, that ends when a bomb goes off in the family garage, killing Rick's wife, Diane, and it is implied a young Beth along with her. Rick, watching the scan beside his captors, insists the memory is fabricated, planted there as some kind of defense mechanism or trick. For years, that denial was simply allowed to sit there, unresolved, and fans argued over whether Rick was telling the truth or lying to protect himself from something he could not face. This is also the episode where Rick engineers an escape from Federation custody so catastrophic, it guts the Council of Ricks and throws the Citadel of Ricks into chaos, which is its own enormous story we will get to properly later. For now, hold on to the garage. The answer to whether that garage memory was real did not arrive until the Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, which aired in September of 2021, more than 4 years after the memory first appeared on screen. This is the episode that finally confirms the bomb was real. Diane and young Beth did die in that explosion. The one piece of the memory that had actually been altered turns out to be smaller than anyone expected. Rick did not build the portal gun in the immediate aftermath, in some grief-fueled instant of inspiration, the way the fabricated version implied. In the true version, he went to a hospital first. That is it. That is the lie he told himself and the Federation. Not that his family died, but that his grief did not have a slower, more human shape before it hardened into decades of interdimensional revenge. And this same episode reveals who was behind the bombing. Not a random act of violence, but another Rick from another reality, a Rick our Rick had once known, who would go on to become the single villain the series spent years building toward, the one fans and the writers now call Rick Prime. The reason behind the bombing, once it is finally laid out, is almost uncomfortably small for the scale of devastation it caused. Before interdimensional travel existed the way we know it, an alternate version of Rick, the one who would become Rick Prime, approached our Rick and offered to share access to portal technology, to bring him into a wider multiversal life. Our Rick said no. He wanted to stay with his family, stay ordinary, stay put. Rick Prime, in what plays as some mixture of rejection and jealousy and cruelty that is never fully spelled out, killed Diane and Beth in retaliation. Grief and rage are what actually invented the portal gun, not curiosity. Everything Rick has done across the entire series, All the interdimensional recklessness, the running, the drinking, the refusal to let anyone get close without also pushing them away, traces back to a decision he made to choose his family over a version of himself who then punished him for it by taking that family away. That is the emotional engine underneath nearly every joke ever told at Rick's expense, and once you know it, you cannot really watch the early seasons the same way again. For me, this is the sharpest, saddest thing the writers have ever pulled off, precisely because it hides in plain sight behind so many bad puns and so much vomit humor that you can watch 2 full seasons without suspecting it is there. There is a specific cruelty buried in the shape of that decision that I do not think gets talked about enough, and it has to do with how ordinary Rick's original choice actually was. He was not offered power for its own sake, or wealth, or some grand cosmic destiny he turned down out of principle. He was offered a wider life, in the vaguest, most tempting sense a restless, brilliant person can be tempted, and he said no because he wanted to keep having dinner with his wife and his daughter. That is about as small and human a reason as this series ever gives a character for anything, and it is precisely the smallness of it that makes Rick Prime's retaliation so disproportionate, so plainly monstrous once you actually weigh the mismatch. A man asked another version of himself to come explore infinity with him, got told no because of a family dinner, and answered by making sure that family would never sit down to another one. Rick has spent the rest of his life since then punishing himself for a version of the same instinct, ordinary domestic contentment, as though the wanting itself were the mistake, rather than the man who turned that wanting into a reason for murder. Over the next 2 years, Rick Prime got built from a name into an actual character. Season 6's premiere, Solarix, which reached screens in September of 2022, reintroduces him as the series' central antagonist, the culmination of everything the Diane reveal had set up. That same premiere strands Rick and Morty back in their separate original dimensions after the previous finale, a bit of housekeeping that reasserts, without much fuss, just how displaced this particular pair has always been. But the true ending of that thread, the one that finally closes the loop opened by a flickering garage memory back in Season 3, comes in Season 7's 5th episode, Unmortricken, from November of 2023. This episode introduces the Omega device, a weapon Rick Prime built that does something genuinely horrifying by this show's own standards. It does not just kill a person, it erases them and every single multiversal variant of them, everywhere, all at once. Rick Prime had already used it once, years earlier, on Diane, which is why there is no version of her left anywhere in the entire multiverse to find. Not in some far-flung dimension, not on some parallel Earth, nowhere. Every Diane Sanchez across every reality died the same death at the same moment, including the one who would have been the current family's own maternal grandmother. This is worth stating as plainly as I can because it is the kind of detail casual viewers get wrong constantly. And getting it wrong changes the whole emotional shape of Rick's arc. There is no universe out there with a living Diane in it. Rick cannot visit one, he cannot find one. The multiverse this whole story is built on is enormous, practically infinite, and this is the one door in it that is permanently, deliberately shut. In that same episode, Evil Morty, who has his own long story we will get into shortly, disarms Rick Prime and destroys his backup contingencies, the safety nets a character like that would ordinarily use to cheat death the way so many others in this series casually do. And then Evil Morty simply lets our Rick beat Rick Prime to death with his bare hands. Rick Prime stays defiant, right to the end, mocking Rick as the blows land, telling him that hunting him for decades has only made the two of them the same man. It is not the clean catharsis you might expect from a revenge this long in coming. No twist, no last-minute escape, no clone waiting in reserve. Writers and audience have both treated this death as final, the actual end of a story that began 7 full seasons earlier with a fabricated memory nobody thought to question. There is one more piece worth mentioning, the Season 8 finale, Hot Rick, because it closes the emotional loop even more precisely than the death of Rick Prime does. Rick decides, in the most Rick way imaginable, that the way to finally move on is to delete his own memories of Diane outright, to reset himself clean of her. What complicates that plan is a construct the episode calls Memory Rick, a sentient version of Rick pulled out of someone else's memory who fights to protect the last surviving memory of Diane rather than let it be erased along with the rest. Against the odds and in apparent defiance of the Omega device, that one memory of Diane holds on, and Rick ends up letting Memory Rick and this Memory Diane live on together. Sealed inside a pod, a small mindscape simulation, he ejects far away from himself and the rest of the family with a warning never to try to come back. It would be easy and wrong to read this as a loophole, as though the writers found a backdoor and brought Diane back after insisting for 2 seasons that she was permanently gone. They have not. Memory Diane is not a living person occupying a real universe somewhere. She is a fragment of memory allowed to keep existing in isolation rather than be destroyed. The distinction matters because if you tell this story as Rick found a way to get his wife back, you are telling a softer, different story than the one that was actually written, which is about a man who could neither fully hold on to his grief nor fully delete it, and settled instead for sealing it somewhere it could not reach anyone he loves. What I keep coming back to with this whole arc is how patient it is, and how unusual that patience is for something that spends so much of its runtime being deliberately, aggressively silly. 4 years passed in real time between the moment Rick told a lie about a bomb and the moment the truth finally arrived. That is not a plot twist withheld for shock value. That is closer to how actual grief works, denied for a long time and then, finally, unavoidably, faced. All of it could have been revealed in one episode and dropped. Instead, the lie was left to sit there, load-bearing under everything Rick did and said for years of episodes, and only pulled out when it had gathered enough weight to actually mean something when it gave way. That patience, that comfort with leaving a wound open for years before deciding whether to close it, is not unique to Rick's story. Rick and Morty does something structurally similar, though it lands on a very different final decision, with its version of Beth Smith. And this is the one place where the writers have told the audience plainly from outside the text itself that there will never be a resolution at all. The setup begins in Season 3's 9th episode, The ABCs of Beth, which arrived in September of 2017. On the surface, it is an episode about Beth reconnecting with a childhood best friend who turns out to have become the ruler of a small, brutal fantasy dimension. The kind of premise this series treats as a completely normal Tuesday. Underneath that, though, it is doing something quieter and much more important. It is the first time Beth seriously confronts the life she gave up. She was a promising surgeon, cut from the same cloth as her father, brilliant and restless in the same specific way Rick is, and this episode finally puts language to a question that had been humming under everything since the pilot. Whether Beth resents the family she built with Jerry, whether she wonders what her life might look like if she had left the way Rick eventually taught Morty to consider leaving. Rick, watching his daughter wrestle with it, makes her an offer that is horrifying and tender in exactly the proportions this story specializes in. He tells her he can clone her perfectly so that she could go and live the adventurous, unattached life she gave up, while a clone stays behind, indistinguishable, to raise Summer and Morty in her place. The same episode also gives us the closest thing to an origin story for Beth and Jerry as a couple, showing that Beth got pregnant with Summer at 17, back when she and Jerry were still teenagers, and that they very nearly chose not to keep the pregnancy before deciding to stay together and have her. By the end of The ABCs of Beth, it is left deliberately unclear whether Beth took Rick up on the clone offer or not. The episode plants the possibility and then declines to confirm it, which, if you were watching in real time, might have felt like a loose thread that would get tidied up eventually. It did not get tidied up. It sat there for 3 more years. The confirmation, when it finally came, arrived in the Season 4 finale, Star-Mort Rick turn of the Jerry. This episode does 2 things at once. It is the first full appearance of what fans now call Space Beth, a version of Beth living the exact unattached, adventuring life the original offer described, and it confirms, explicitly, that Rick did clone his daughter. What makes the confirmation land so strangely is the specific detail attached to it. Rick did not just clone Beth and keep careful, meticulous track of which version was the copy, the way you might expect from a character obsessed with control and precision in literally every other area of his life. He deliberately erased his own memory of which pod held the clone and which held the original, so that even he, the one person with the technical ability to know for certain, does not know. That is not an accident of the plot. It is a choice the writers make Rick make on purpose. And once you notice it, the mystery stops being which Beth is real and becomes something closer to why a man who needs to control everything would choose, deliberately, to make this one thing permanently unknowable, including to himself. I think that choice is the whole point of the episode, more than the reveal itself. Rick spends the rest of the series solving impossible problems, rewriting the rules of physics, cheating death for himself and for the people he loves. And yet here, in the one situation where the open question is about his own daughter's fundamental identity, he engineers his own ignorance rather than hold on to an answer that might force him or her to treat one Beth as more real than the other. Read that way, the amnesia is not a plot contrivance. It is closer to an act of mercy, clumsy and strange in the specific way this series delivers almost all of its tenderness, but mercy all the same. And Rick and Morty has never walked it back. Both Beths are alive as of the latest seasons. House Beth keeps raising the kids and living the life the original built with Jerry. Space Beth pursues the adventurous, dangerous, often very funny life the clone offer promised. At one point, even joining Rick on interdimensional heists in a later season. The two of them meet, argue, occasionally come to blows, and eventually reach a version of peace with each other, one built specifically on both of them, agreeing not to chase the single question that would define which of them gets to claim the word real. Space Beth's presence has ebbed and flowed a little, used more sparingly in some stretches than others, and by the time the current, still airing season began, she was back in the family fold, present in the trailers and the premiere without any clone reveal attached to her return. The mystery, as of this recording, stays exactly as open as it was the day it was confirmed to exist. This is a case where the writers themselves have taken the guesswork out of how we should talk about it. This is not a mystery they left dangling because they had not gotten around to answering it, the way some long-running shows leave threads, hanging simply because nobody remembered to pick them up. The people who make Rick and Morty have described this specific storyline as something they consider intentionally, permanently unresolved. A mystery built to never pay off, because paying it off would undercut the actual argument the story is making. If one Beth were revealed as the real one and the other confirmed as the copy, the message would be that clones are lesser, that identity depends on some traceable chain back to an original, that Space Beth's years of lived experience and House Beth's years of lived experience are not equally hers to claim. Instead, by refusing the reveal forever, the story gets to make a stranger and, I think, more interesting argument that the question of which one is real was never the right question to be asking about either of them. It is worth pausing on how neatly this pairs with everything we just covered about Rick and Diane, even though the two storylines land in completely opposite places. Rick's mystery was about a truth being withheld and eventually revealed, a lie that had to collapse before the story could move forward. Beth's is about a truth the writers generated and then made permanently unreachable, a question built specifically so that no one, not the audience, not the characters, not even Rick himself, could ever answer it. Both are fundamentally about originals and copies, about what happens to identity when you introduce the specter of duplication into a family that otherwise thinks of itself as ordinary. One story ends in a name and a body and a death. The other ends in two women choosing together not to ask. I find the second choice a lot braver, honestly, both as a piece of writing and as something for two characters to agree to inside the story. It would be so easy for either Beth to spend the rest of her life quietly resenting the other, under the surface of every family dinner over a question neither can answer, and to its credit, the writing refuses to let that resentment become the point. If Rick's mystery is about a lie eventually confirmed and Beth's is about a question built to stay open forever, then evil Morty sits somewhere between the two, a mystery that has been running since practically the beginning and has only very recently gotten anything resembling an ending, though even that ending leaves the biggest question about him completely untouched. Evil Morty first appears in the 10th episode of Season 1, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, which aired in April of 2014, making him one of the oldest ongoing mysteries here. On first watch, he barely registers as significant. He is introduced as the Morty, belonging to a version of Rick, competing in a kind of interdimensional bounty hunt, and his defining visual trait, an eye patch that reads as a throwaway joke about grizzled toughness, turns out much later to have been doing real narrative work the whole time. Even in this first appearance, there are small, unsettling touches, a controlled quality to him, a stillness none of the other Mortys share, a sense that he is watching the chaos around him rather than taking part the way an ordinary, anxious Morty would. Fans noticed something was off about him almost immediately, and true to form, nothing got explained. He simply vanished from the story for 2 more seasons. He resurfaces properly in one of the best-regarded episodes the series has ever produced. The Ricklantis Mix-Up, the 7th episode of Season 3, first aired in September of 2017. It is structured almost like an anthology, cutting between several storylines set on the Citadel of Ricks, the enormous, densely populated space station built entirely out of alternate universe Ricks and Mortys, which had been wrecked earlier that same season and was, by this point, in the middle of rebuilding itself with a new elected government. One of those storylines follows a nervous, unassuming Morty running an underdog campaign for Citadel president, and the runtime treats him with real sympathy, showing him as sincere, a little out of his depth, trying to do right by a citizenry that mostly sees Mortys as disposable labor. Then, in the final minutes, comes the reveal that this candidate is Evil Morty, that his entire campaign persona was a manipulation, and that his rivals within the Citadel's shadow government get purged decisively and without mercy the moment he actually holds power. It is a gut punch of an ending precisely because you were made to like him first. I want to head off a mix-up that shows up constantly in casual conversation. This coup and purge happen in the Ricklantis mix-up, not in the Rick Churian Morty date, which is a different episode entirely, the actual Season 3 finale, built around an unrelated plot involving a creature hidden in tunnels beneath the White House. The 2 titles sound similar enough and both involve high-stakes political chaos that people conflate them constantly, but Evil Morty's presidency belongs entirely to the Ricklantis episode. For 2 more seasons, Evil Morty governs the Citadel from the shadows of that presidency, mostly off-screen, until he finally gets the ending that had been building since his very first appearance. In Rick Murray Jack, the Season 5 finale, the same episode that confirms the truth about Diane's death, Evil Morty makes his move. He escapes the Citadel entirely and, in doing so, destroys something called the Central Finite Curve. It is worth explaining exactly what that is because the concept does a lot of quiet structural work across the whole series, more than most casual viewers probably clock. The Central Finite Curve is a deliberately bounded slice of the infinite multiverse, a curated subset of realities that the collective Ricks across every dimension have maintained and enforced so that within its borders a version of Rick is always reliably the smartest being around. Every Rick and Morty and Jerry and Beth we watch across the mainline story exists inside this curve. It is, in effect, a cage the Ricks built for themselves and everyone around them, disguised as the natural shape of reality in order to guarantee their own supremacy stays uncontested. Evil Morty, in that finale, overloads the Citadel's central dimensional infrastructure and forces a breach clean through the curve's boundary, escaping into the vast, uncontrolled multiverse beyond it, a place where, for all anyone knows, there might be minds greater than any Ricks waiting. In the same scene, he removes the eye patch for the first time and destroys it, and it is revealed to have never been cosmetic at all. It was a functioning remote control device, something he had been using this entire time to secretly puppeteer the specific Rick he had been traveling with, steering that Rick's choices without the man ever realizing his own free will had been compromised. That was, for a long time, where Evil Morty's story ended, an open door into the wider multiverse with no confirmation of what waited on the other side. It stayed that way for years of real time, across the recasting of both lead voice actors, across an entire season and a half of other stories. Then, in the first episode of the current season, There's Something About Morty, which aired in May of 2026, the thread finally got picked back up. The premiere dresses itself up, at first, as a fairly standard multiversal mission against a dangerous hive mind called the Collective, with Morty spiraling into a fresh, familiar worry that Rick and Evil Morty privately texting each other about dimensional threats means he is about to be replaced. Then it narrows, fast into something far more personal. It turns out Rick has secretly been in contact with Evil Morty the whole time, and Evil Morty has been quietly blackmailing him using an Omega device of his own, the same category of weapon that erased Diane from existence, to hold hostages over Rick and force his cooperation. The episode ends with the Federation's fourth-dimensional Time Cops, a group first introduced back in Season 2, catching up to Evil Morty and arresting him for crimes against the fabric of space-time itself. It is, as far as anything on screen has shown, the first unambiguous defeat Evil Morty has ever suffered. Every previous appearance ended with him ahead, one step further into control than anyone realized. This one ends with him in custody. I have to flag something here because this is genuinely fresh information as of this recording, and it would be easy to overstate how settled it feels. An arrest is not the same as an ending. We do not know, and it has not been shown whether this capture is permanent, whether it is a temporary setback before another escalation, or whether Evil Morty simply exits the story here after more than a decade of buildup. Treat that uncertainty as exactly what it is, an open question with no answer yet, rather than a conclusion. And underneath all of it, running the entire length of this arc from that first eye-patched appearance in Season 1 through his recent arrest, sits the one question never confirmed at all, who Evil Morty actually is, underneath the manipulation and the stillness and the eye patch. There is a theory extremely popular among longtime fans that Evil Morty is not really a Morty at all in the way we understand the term, that he is instead a Rick, one of the multiverse's endless supply of brilliant, damaged old men, who somehow transferred his consciousness into a young Morty's body, using an unremarkable, socially invisible form as the perfect disguise from which to plot an escape the Ricks would never see coming from a Morty. It is a compelling theory. It fits his calm, calculating affect. It fits his hatred of the system the Ricks built to keep Mortys disposable, and it fits the sheer scale of what he eventually pulls off. But I want to be precise about what it is, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets repeated so often online it starts to feel like it was confirmed somewhere. It was not. No episode has ever stated, on screen, that Evil Morty used to be a Rick. He has never been given an origin scene, never been recognized by another character from a previous life, never shown in a transfer or a swap. The theory survives entirely on inference and vibes, however well argued those vibes might be. Whatever Evil Morty actually is, wherever he actually came from, that specific door has stayed closed longer than almost anything else in the run, and even his own arrest, dramatic as it was, did nothing to open it. Part of why the Rick in Disguise theory has stayed so popular for so long, I think, is that it would resolve something the story otherwise leaves legitimately uncomfortable. The fact that a Morty, an ordinary, disposable, interchangeable Morty of the exact kind the Citadel treats as an underclass, might simply be capable of everything Evil Morty has done, without needing to secretly be a Rick at all. If the theory is true, his brilliance has a tidy explanation, a smuggled-in Rick brain wearing a child's face. If it is false, and it has certainly never been confirmed true, then the more unsettling possibility is the one sitting right there in plain sight, that Mortys were never actually less capable than Ricks to begin with, only treated that way, kept small and disposable by a system built specifically to make sure no one ever tested the assumption. I happen to think the second version is the more interesting read, and probably the one the writers are betting on without saying so. Though I will say it outright, this is my own interpretation stacked on top of an already unconfirmed fan theory. 2 full steps removed from anything stated on screen, and it deserves exactly that much skepticism in return. What I find most striking about Evil Morty, watching the whole arc back to back the way researching this puts you in a position to do, is how much the writing trusts its audience to hold an incomplete picture for over a decade without losing patience. Most shows this long would have cracked and explained him by now, given him a flashback episode, a tragic monologue, something to make the audience feel rewarded for paying attention. Rick and Morty just keeps handing you more behavior and less explanation, betting that watching what he does is more interesting than knowing why. So far, based on how much conversation this character still generates more than a decade after his first forgettable appearance, the bet has paid off. There is something almost funny about the title chosen for the episode that finally handed Evil Morty his first real defeat. There's something about Morty is a flat, generic phrase, the kind of title that undersells its own episode on purpose, sitting in stark contrast to the decade of buildup the character had piled up by the time it aired. I do not think the mismatch is an accident. A series this deliberate about withholding fanfare from its biggest reveals, the same one that let Diane's death arrive inside a Federation interrogation rather than a grand flashback, is entirely capable of choosing an unassuming title on purpose, refusing to let the marketing do the emotional work the episode itself is supposed to earn. Nothing warns you, not the title, not anything else, that this is where the oldest running mystery in the whole run finally loses a fight for the first time. You just have to watch it happen. Evil Morty's story turns out to be inseparable from the story of the place he eventually escaped, and that place deserves its own attention because the Citadel of Ricks is one of the strangest pieces of world building Rick and Morty has ever attempted. And most of what makes it strange never gets its own spotlight the way Rick or Morty or Beth do. The idea behind the Citadel is simple to state and unsettling to actually picture. Somewhere out in the layered mess of the multiverse, countless alternate Ricks, from countless alternate timelines, decided that instead of endlessly competing or destroying each other, they would build a shared home, a whole society made of nothing but versions of the same two people, Rick and Morty, repeated across an enormous population. It works as a city, a government, an economy, all built from duplicates of a family we otherwise only ever see one version of at a time. We got our first real look inside it earlier, back when we were covering how the truth about Diane surfaced in The Rick Shank Rickdemption, the Season 3 premiere from April of 2017. What that episode does with the Citadel, though, deserves its own telling here rather than a passing mention. Rick, held prisoner by the Galactic Federation, orchestrates an escape so audacious it barely reads as sane. In the chaos he sets off, the Citadel of Ricks and the Galactic Federation end up tearing into each other, and enormous numbers of Ricks and Mortys die in the collapse. Depending how you count it, that single sequence likely killed more named and unnamed versions of Rick and Morty than any other event across the whole series, and Rick treats it as an acceptable cost of getting free. It is worth pausing on how casually the death gets framed, because that casualness is doing real characterization work. This is a Rick with access to uncounted duplicates of himself, backups upon backups scattered across the multiverse, and wiping out an entire population built from those duplicates barely registers to him as a loss the way it would to almost anyone else. The Citadel does not stay rubble for long, which is itself telling. A society built by beings with access to near infinite resources and infinite duplicate labor rebuilds fast. By the time we return to it in the Ricklantis Mix-Up, the episode we just spent time on for Evil Morty's political rise, the Citadel has reconstructed itself into something far more institutionally developed than the loose federation of Ricks glimpsed before its destruction. It has an elected government, complete with a presidential race. It has a visible, entrenched class system with Ricks at the top of it almost by default, treated as inherently more valuable, more capable, more deserving of comfort, simply for being Ricks. Mortys, meanwhile, are pushed into the underclass, doing menial labor, treated as disposable and largely interchangeable, which is a bleak inversion of how the mainline story usually treats the Rick and Morty relationship, since their Morty is at least nominally a person Rick claims to care about, however badly he shows it. Inside the Citadel, stripped of that one relationship, Mortys are simply a resource class. The individual threads are what sell that world, a jaded Rick cop breaking in an idealistic young Morty cop who still believes the system can be decent, a factory Morty grinding away on an assembly line, a cluster of schoolyard Mortys, each little story a self-contained tragedy about life at the bottom of a society run by men who all share the same face. The episode layers a corrupt police force and an organized crime element on top of that divide, and by the time Evil Morty's storyline reveals itself as the through line connecting all of it, the Citadel has been fully drawn as a functioning, deeply unequal society, one that mirrors real-world class and labor dynamics closely enough that it is easy to read the whole thing as pointed social commentary dressed up as science fiction. I think that reading is basically correct, and I think it is also why this particular episode gets cited so often as one of the best in the entire run, because it does the thing Rick and Morty does best at its peak, using an absurd premise to make an uncomfortably clear point about how power actually organizes itself. We already covered what happens to the Citadel next when we talked about Evil Morty's escape. In the Season 5 finale, his breach of the central finite curve brings the whole structure down again, a second destruction inside the same series, killing most of the Ricks and Mortys still living there. What is worth adding here, on the institutional side of that event, rather than the personal side, is just how strange it is that a story would build out an entire multiversal government, give it an election, a class structure, a police force, a mafia, and then demolish it not once but twice within the span of a few seasons. Most shows introduce a setting like the Citadel and treat it as a stable home base to return to indefinitely. Rick and Morty treats it as something closer to a sandcastle, elaborate and specific and honestly fascinating while it stands, and then gone the moment the story needs it gone, with barely a beat of mourning attached. What happened to the Citadel after that second destruction is one of the thinner threads in this whole landscape, and I want to be upfront about how thin. There is some indication in later seasons that surviving Ricks and Mortys have begun reorganizing scattered remnants of Citadel society, including references to a specific Rick variant, taking on some kind of controlling role over what is left. The sourcing on exactly how organized or how significant that rebuilding effort is stays fairly secondary and unconfirmed, enough for me to mention it, but not enough to describe to you as settled fact. If you go looking for a clean answer about the Citadel's current government as of the current season, you will not find one on screen. You will find scattered secondary hints that something is being rebuilt, again, out of the wreckage, again, the way it always has been. One clarification before we move on, because I have seen this mistake made constantly and it is worth heading off directly. There is a recurring human character, full name Andre Curtis, the President of the United States within this version of Earth, who first shows up unnamed back in Season 2, only picking up the surname Curtis a few seasons later, and stays in office for years of runtime afterward. He has nothing to do with the Citadel of Ricks. He is not a Citadel president, not a Citadel official, not connected in any way to the multiversal Rick government we have just spent all this time describing. The two get conflated sometimes simply because both are, in their own separate spheres, presidents dealing with Rick-adjacent chaos, but they are entirely different characters in entirely different corners of the world, and treating them as the same figure or as connected at all is simply an error, not a hidden layer of lore waiting to be uncovered. What the Citadel leaves me with, more than any specific plot thread inside it, is a kind of vertigo about what it means to build a whole society out of duplicated main characters, and then use that society almost exclusively to ask how power reproduces itself even when identity does not stay singular. Every Rick in that place believes, on some level, that he is the real one, the important one, the one whose choices matter. And the answer, delivered through two separate demolitions and one deeply unequal government in between, seems to be that none of that belief actually protects you from being disposable inside a system built by people exactly like you. I also think the Citadel works as a kind of dark control group for everything else on this list, a version of Rick's world with the one variable removed that makes the mainline story bearable. Every relationship we spent tonight tracing, Rick and Diane, Rick and Beth, Rick and Morty himself, survives specifically because someone in it refuses to treat the other as interchangeable, refuses to let a duplicate stand in for the actual, specific person they love. The Citadel is what this universe looks like once that refusal gets stripped away entirely, once every Rick is just a Rick and every Morty is just a Morty, sorted by function rather than held onto by name. It is not a coincidence, I think, that it is also the site of the two largest, coldest death tolls in the entire series. A society built on treating people as fungible turns out, in this story's own accounting, to be a society that can absorb almost unlimited loss without ever really grieving any of it. And that is about as close to a warning as this particular cartoon ever gets to delivering outright. Not every mystery here needs multiple seasons and a body count to earn its place. And there's no better example than a small, soft-spoken, vaguely reptilian family friend who has never once raised his voice and has still managed to stay among the longest-standing unanswered questions in the whole run. Mr. Poopybutthole first shows up in Total Recall, the 4th episode of Season 2, built entirely around a memory parasite infestation, tiny alien creatures that implant false, invented memories of themselves into the Smith family's minds so convincingly that everyone in the house believes these fabricated characters have always been part of their lives. For most of the episode, the family, and the audience along with them, cannot tell which characters are real and which are parasites in disguise. And the tension resolves through a brutally simple rule Rick lands on. Any character whose backstory feels too neatly, suspiciously positive is almost certainly fake, because parasites always design themselves to be beloved. Under that logic, Beth ends up shooting Mr. Poopybutthole, assuming he is one of the parasites, only for a small, quietly funny gut punch of a beat, to reveal that he was real all along, an actual, long-standing family friend who simply happened to have the kind of unconditionally warm backstory that made him look suspicious next to everyone genuinely manufactured for the episode. He spends the rest of that first appearance recovering from being shot by a woman who has apparently known him for years, which is about as Rick and Morty an introduction as a character can get. Tenderness and violence in the same beat, aimed at the same person, with neither one canceling the other out. From there, Mr. Poopybutthole settles in as a fixture of the recurring cast, mostly stationed in post-credit scenes, checking in on the family, updating the audience on his own slowly unfolding life the way a background character in a soap opera might, except played entirely straight and entirely deadpan. We learn gradually that he has a wife, Amy, referred to as Mrs. Poopybutthole, and the marriage is tracked across several seasons with more patience than some of the main relationships get, with a divorce revealed in a post-credits scene and the character still visibly heartbroken and processing that loss seasons later. His name, or at least the name underneath the name everyone actually calls him, gets revealed only recently in the Season 7 premiere, How Poopy Got His Poop Back, which confirms his first name is Wayne. It is a small detail, almost a throwaway, but it lands with a strange kind of weight after so many seasons of a character existing purely as a nickname, as though the writers waited until we had spent years caring about him before finally handing over something that ordinary and human, as though the name itself had to be earned before it would mean anything. None of that, though, touches the actual mystery, which has nothing to do with his marriage or his name, and everything to do with what he physically is. Mr. Poopybutthole does not resemble any species otherwise established, and unlike almost every other alien design Rick and Morty puts on screen, which usually gets at least a passing verbal explanation or a background sight gag placing where it is from, his origin has never been addressed directly at all. Within the fiction, Galactic Federation scientists have at points informally referred to his unclassified species by a slang nickname, calling creatures like him sausage fellas, which is funny and also tells you almost nothing, since it is presented as an outsider's shorthand rather than an actual taxonomic answer. Outside the show, the closest thing to an answer anyone has ever gotten is Dan Harmon, one of the creators, occasionally offering loose, speculative comments about the character in interviews, none of which have ever been folded into the show itself as confirmed backstory. Speculation from a creator in an interview is not the same as canon, and I want to be clear that nothing said off-screen changes what has or has not actually been established on it. If anything, the mystery has recently been made deeper rather than closer to resolved. The Season 8 finale ends with a scene that plays innocently at first, Mr. Poopybutthole breaking the fourth wall to thank the audience for another season, before the frame pulls back to reveal that what we are watching is a recording, being examined by his estranged wife Amy and a group of scientists of their own species, the so-called sausage fellas. Their verdict is alarming in the calmest possible way. The atomic frequency of the creature on that tape does not match the composition of their reality at all, which means, by their own reckoning, that the Mr. Poopybutthole this family has known for years might be an imposter, or at least a version of him from somewhere else entirely. It picks up a thread from the previous season finale, where he had slipped through a portal into a reality in which his family never left him and switched places with his alternate self. It is a detail that raises far more questions than it answers and offers no follow-up whatsoever. It is hard not to read that choice as deliberate, a kind of wink acknowledging that fans have spent years trying to crack this character's origin, followed immediately by one more contradictory puzzle piece rather than a resolution. As of the latest season, his species stays completely unclassified, on screen and off, with no indication that is going to change. What keeps me coming back to Mr. Poopybutthole more than the puzzle of his species is what an unusual kind of mystery this is to build. Nearly everything else we have talked about tonight is heavy, dead wives, self-erased memories, coups, mass casualty events measured in duplicate lives. His mystery sits inside a character who is, by design, the gentlest and most emotionally stable person in this whole family's orbit, a guy whose defining trait is checking in on everyone else's chaos with total calm and total kindness. And the one thing the writers will never tell you about him is the most basic biographical fact a person can have: which planet or dimension or category of life he actually belongs to. There is something disarming about that, honestly, the idea that you are trusted to love a character completely without ever needing to categorize him. It is the opposite instinct from almost every other mystery in this list, all of which eventually got weighed down by the audience's need for an answer. This one just gets to stay strange forever without anyone treating that strangeness as a problem to solve. It is worth noticing, too, how much narrative real estate has been spent on a character whose entire function could easily have been a single running gag. A name this juvenile, this obviously built for a cheap laugh, would be enough material for most shows to wring a handful of jokes out of and then retire without another thought. Rick and Morty instead gave him a marriage, a divorce, a real name hiding underneath the joke name, a species mystery deep enough to anchor its own section of a video like this one, and a habit of checking in on this family, uninvited but always welcome across nearly every season made. That kind of investment in a background character is not really about plot efficiency. It reads more like the writers insisting, without ever saying so directly, that even the smallest, silliest creations deserve the same patience and continuity extended to Rick or Morty or Beth, which fits a series that has, across everything we covered tonight, consistently cared more about its characters as people than about the mechanics of whatever science fiction premise happens to be surrounding them. Jerry Smith does not get nearly as much credit as he deserves for how much unexamined backstory sits underneath a character mostly treated as a punching bag. And the little we have been told about where he comes from is stranger and funnier than his mild, insecure adult demeanor would ever suggest. We get our clearest look at Jerry's family of origin early, in Anatomy Park, the third episode of the first season, an episode mostly remembered for its miniaturized theme park inside-a-body premise rather than anything to do with Jerry. Tucked inside it, almost as an aside, is a visit to Jerry's parents, and the scene reveals that they have entered into a throuple with a much younger man named Jacob. It is played entirely for comedy, a quick, mortifying beat for Jerry to react to and then move past. And it never really gets unpacked what it might mean that Jerry now orbits a household willing to reinvent itself that dramatically. I bring it up because it is easy to watch Jerry across the whole series as simply insecure, simply weak, simply the family's punchline, without ever connecting that insecurity to the fact that his own parents modeled a home life unconventional enough to embarrass him on sight. That connection never gets spelled out either. The two facts are just left sitting near each other, and you get to decide whether they are related. The more consequential Jerry storyline, the one that actually shapes years of ongoing structure, is his marriage to Beth, and that marriage has been through more upheaval than a casual viewer catching random episodes out of order might realize. The two of them divorce at the very start of season 3 in The Rick Shank Rickdemption, the same premiere where Rick's garage memory got pulled out of his head and the first Citadel of Ricks came down. Beth, in that episode, chooses Rick, chooses the chaos and possibility he represents over the stability Jerry offers, and the divorce plays as a serious, consequential rupture rather than a joke. It does not stay that way for the whole season. By the finale, the Rick, Chury, and Morty date, the two of them reconcile, and things move forward from there with Jerry and Beth back together, married for years of subsequent episodes. Their relationship keeps evolving past that reconciliation in ways that push well past a simple return to the status quo. By season 6, Beth begins a relationship with Space Beth, her own clone, which is about as strange a sentence as this series has ever forced me to say out loud. And Jerry, after an adjustment period nobody rushes, comes to accept it, not as a betrayal to be punished, but as a genuine, ongoing part of the family's new shape. What results, carrying forward into the latest seasons, is a household built around 3 adults, Jerry, House Beth, and Space Beth, navigating something closer to a functioning 3-way domestic arrangement than a marriage in any conventional sense. And it gets treated with a surprising lack of judgment, played for warmth and awkward comedy in roughly equal measure rather than scandal. I think Jerry's arc, taken as a whole, from thruple-adjacent embarrassment to a man who eventually accepts and settles into an unconventional family shape of his own, is one of the more understated, optimistic through lines the series has, buried under how relentlessly it mocks him along the way. He starts out as the family's designated failure, and by the last several seasons he has, in his own bumbling, unglamorous way, become the one adult in the household willing to adapt to something truly strange without falling apart over it. That is not nothing on a show this committed to punishing its characters for growth. The Vindicators storyline sits in a rougher, less redemptive corner of Jerry and Rick's shared orbit, and it is worth walking through carefully because it is one of the more casually brutal things Rick and Morty has ever done to a group of characters introduced as essentially a parody of a superhero team. Vindicators 3, The Return of World Ender, the 4th episode of Season 3, drops Rick and Morty into an adventure alongside this recurring group of over-the-top interdimensional heroes, and the episode spends its first stretch playing the material fairly straight, a heist and rescue mission with the usual superhero team banter. Underneath the surface, though, Rick is nursing a grudge, still quietly furious over a past slight from earlier in the group's history, and he builds a gauntlet for the mission that is secretly booby-trapped, weaponized against his own teammates rather than the enemy they are supposedly fighting. The fallout is startling in how many named characters it kills in a single episode. Vance Maximus, the team's nominal leader, dies fleeing through a vent, caught in a sequence brutal enough that it almost plays as a slasher beat rather than a superhero death. Alan Rails, a hero whose power is summoning ghost trains, dies in a brawl with a teammate called Million Ants, a hive of insects in the shape of a man, in a moment as petty as it is violent. Crocubot dies over something as absurd as a wrong trivia answer, guessing the location wrong under pressure. The rest of the roster goes down in the same general chaos, with only a couple of the team left, standing by the time the smoke clears. The two survivors tell you something about the episode's sense of humor. Supernova, one of the more powerful members, slips away before she can be held accountable for anything, while the one character Rick actually ends the night celebrating is Noob, the lowly janitor nobody else on the team ever bothered to respect. By the end of the hour, most of the team introduced at the start of it is simply gone, and there is no lingering on grief or consequence after a body count that steep. It moves on to the next joke almost immediately, which is, I think, exactly the point being made about how casually this universe treats disposable heroism. There is one strange wrinkle worth mentioning for anyone who goes looking for these characters afterward. Vance Maximus, despite dying in that Season 3 episode, turns up alive and well in a separate short-form spin-off called Vindicators 2, which is set chronologically before his mainline death, and works as its own self-contained prequel, rather than any kind of resurrection or retcon within the actual timeline. If you stumble across that spin-off and wonder how a dead character is walking around in it, that is the explanation. It takes place earlier, outside the main show, not after. What strikes me about the Vindicators episode, sitting next to everything else we have covered tonight, is how differently mass death gets treated depending on which characters are dying. When alternate Ricks and Mortys die by the hundreds inside the Citadel, it is framed almost abstractly, a cost of doing business in a multiverse this crowded with duplicates. When the Vindicators die, one at a time, each with a small, specific, almost petty cause of death attached, it hits differently, more like a slasher film picking off a cast than a cosmic event. I think that contrast is intentional. The writing seems to understand that scale numbs you and specificity does not, and it uses both registers on purpose in different episodes to get very different emotional results out of essentially the same instinct, killing off a group of characters quickly and moving on without much ceremony. Rick's role in that particular massacre is worth weighing on its own, separate from the body count, because it is one of the few times the series lets Rick's pettiness alone, with no grief and no trauma underneath it as an excuse, cause real, irreversible harm. Almost everything else we are tracing tonight runs Rick's worst behavior back to some version of the same wound. The loss of Diane, the fear of losing Morty too, decades of running from a pain he could not name until the story finally let him. The Vindicators' gauntlet has no such excuse attached. Rick built a booby-trapped weapon over a grudge, a slight, something small enough that the episode never even bothers spelling out what set him off. People died because Rick Sanchez, unprompted by grief, simply decided a past insult deserved a body count, and it does not get softened with context the way almost everything else he does gets softened. I think that is deliberate too, a reminder tucked into an otherwise chaotic, joke-heavy hour that not every terrible thing Rick does traces back to Diane. That sometimes the cruelty is just Rick being cruel, with no deeper mystery underneath it to explain the damage away. Of everyone Rick has ever loved, and it is a short list, Unity might be the relationship handled with the most restraint, which is a strange thing to say about a hive-mind alien collective capable of assimilating entire planets. But it is true. Unity first appears in Autoerotic Assimilation, the third episode of Season 2, and the premise alone tells you how a serious ex-girlfriend storyline is going to be handled here by making the ex a single consciousness distributed across the bodies of an entire alien population, able to absorb anyone she touches into her collective mind. Rick and Unity clearly share real history, the kind of easy, worn-in intimacy that only makes sense between two people who have hurt each other before and come back anyway. And for a stretch, the reunion is allowed to feel almost tender before it curdles the way Rick's relationships always seem to. Unity eventually reaches the same conclusion most people close to Rick reach, that his self-destructive patterns, the drinking, the recklessness, the inability to let anyone actually stabilize him, make any real future together unsustainable. She leaves, not out of anger exactly, more out of a clear-eyed refusal to keep absorbing the damage he brings into every relationship he is part of, which, notably, is a refusal almost none of the human characters around Rick ever managed to sustain for long. Beth forgives him constantly. Morty keeps coming back no matter how badly a given adventure goes. Unity, alone among the people who actually know Rick well, walks away and stays away. It is worth being honest about how dark that first episode lets things get once she does. Its final stretch, set almost wordlessly to music, shows Rick alone in a borrowed lab, assembling a death ray and coming about as close to ending his own life as this series has ever allowed him to get, only passing out at the last second before the machine can fire. It is one of the bleakest notes an episode has ever closed on, and it sits underneath every lighter beat their reunion gets years later, a reminder of exactly what her leaving actually cost him. She stays away for a long stretch of runtime, absent for somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 episodes before resurfacing in Air Force Wong, the third episode of Season 7. When she comes back, it is not for a quiet reconciliation. She assimilates the entire state of Virginia, absorbing its whole population into her collective consciousness, on a scale large enough to force Rick's attention, specifically because she has noticed how consumed he has become with his hunt for Rick Prime, and wants to intervene before that obsession finishes destroying whatever is left of him. It is a bold, almost aggressive way to re-enter someone's life, and it is framed that way on purpose. This is not a woman easing back into an old relationship. This is someone using the full scale of what she is capable of to force a conversation Rick would otherwise avoid indefinitely. The episode does not end with them back together, and it does not end with a clean rejection either. Rick tells her he has changed. She does not fully believe him, and that skepticism is left sitting there, unresolved, rather than settled either toward reconciliation or toward a clean goodbye. I find that ending more honest than almost any other relationship beat in the series, precisely because of how it refuses to pick a side. Rick and Morty loves definitive, often violent endings. Characters die, get erased, get arrested, get purged from office. Unity's story just stops, mid-conversation, on a note of doubt that neither confirms nor denies whether Rick is telling the truth about having changed. Given everything we now know about Rick, about the grief underneath his recklessness, about a version of himself that killed his family and turned him into someone who has spent decades unable to let anyone get close without also pushing them away, Unity's skepticism reads less like a personal rejection and more like the accumulated, reasonable caution of someone who has watched this exact pattern fail before and has no particular reason to expect this time is different. We are never told whether she is right to doubt him. The doubt is just allowed to exist. Honestly, the way doubt actually works between two people with real history and no good reason left to trust each other blindly. There is a structural detail about unity worth pausing on a moment longer because it sets up an almost exact mirror image of the Beths mystery we spent so much time on earlier, and it is a comparison the series never draws out loud, which makes it more satisfying to notice on your own. Beths mystery is about one origin splitting into two separate people, two bodies, two independent lives, with no way to determine which one gets to claim the original identity. Unity is built the other direction entirely. One identity, one continuous consciousness, distributed simultaneously across an entire population of separate bodies. All of them her, all of them thinking the same thoughts at once whenever she chooses to fully assimilate a world. Where Beth's story asks what happens to identity when one person becomes two, Unity's existence asks the opposite. What happens to individuality when an entire population becomes one? Neither question gets forced to a resolution, and no attempt is ever made to reconcile the two opposing structures into some single unified theory of selfhood. Both ideas just sit in the same universe, unresolved, available for exactly the kind of side-by-side comparison we are making right now. And I think the fact that they can coexist without anyone needing to pick a winner says something about how loosely and how confidently this series holds its own rules about what a person actually is. What keeps Unity from feeling like a pure thought experiment, a clever science fiction concept wearing the shape of a relationship, is that her hive mind nature is never allowed to erase her specific feelings about Rick underneath it. However many bodies she is occupying, however many planets or states worth of assimilated population she is drawing on at a given moment, the emotional core of her scenes with Rick stays entirely personal, entirely about the two of them and their specific damaged history. That is a harder needle to thread than it sounds on paper. A lesser version of this character could easily read as an abstraction, a symbol of collectivism or conformity standing in for an actual ex-girlfriend. Rick and Morty keeps her grounded instead, letting the science fiction premise sit underneath a very ordinary, very recognizable shape. Someone who loved a difficult person, tried to make it work, and eventually had to leave for her own sake, only to find herself, years later, still checking back in on whether he ever actually changed. Everything we have covered so far has been a mystery with a shape to it, a beginning you can point to, and, in most cases, an ending eventually delivered. What is left is a different category entirely, a handful of loose, self-contained strangenesses scattered across different seasons that never got folded into any larger arc and never asked to be. They are smaller, most of them contained inside a single episode, but I find some of them almost more unsettling than the season-spanning mysteries, precisely because there was never even a pretense of an explanation coming. The strangest of these, for my money, involves a cat. In Claw and Hoarder Special Rick Tim's Morty, which lands midway through Season 4, Rick and Jerry end up on an odd little detour of a subplot involving an unnamed cat that turns out to be capable of speech, and more than that, capable of a kind of psychic manipulation that has apparently been steering elements of the family's life without their knowledge. The cat, voiced with an unnervingly casual charm by Matthew Broderick, attaches itself to Jerry, of all people, and simply refuses to explain itself, insisting the pleasant surface is the only part anyone needs to look at. Rick, being Rick, cannot leave a talking cat alone without trying to understand it, and he eventually scans its mind directly, pulling its thoughts into a shared viewing experience with Jerry beside him. Whatever the two of them see in that scan is never shown to the audience, not even briefly, not even as a blurred or distorted image the way this series sometimes teases things it does not want to fully reveal. The camera simply does not go there. What we get instead is the aftermath, Rick vomiting immediately and violently, and Jerry, of all people, breaking down in tears, visibly shaken in a way he rarely gets to be. The cat, entirely unbothered by having just broken two grown men with the contents of its own mind, offers only one line by way of explanation, delivered with total, dry indifference. Don't ask questions, just have fun, and that is it. The cat never comes back, the scan never gets referenced again, and neither Jerry nor Rick ever gets a later moment to process what they saw. It is one of the only mysteries on this entire list that is not slow-playing an eventual reveal and is not building toward an intentional, thematically justified silence the way Beth's clone status is. It just shows you two men breaking, tells you nothing, and moves on to the next scene like nothing happened. I want to clear up a mix-up before it causes confusion because this cat gets confused constantly with a completely different character from a completely different episode. There is a separate creature that fans and casual conversation sometimes call Tinkles, but that name actually belongs to one of the fake memory parasites from Total Recall, the same episode that gave us Mr. Poopybutthole's introduction, a fabricated character planted into the family's memories rather than a real, ongoing part of the story at all. The two get lumped together sometimes because both involve strange, small creatures delivering unsettling information. But they come from different episodes, different seasons, and different premises entirely, and neither has anything to do with the other. The unnamed talking cat from season 4 is its own standalone mystery, untethered to anything else. And as far as anyone can tell, that is exactly how the writers want it to stay. What makes the cat scene sit so uneasily in the memory, more than almost anything else on this list, is that you get handed every tool you would normally use to guess at an answer, and then none of them are allowed to work. You get a clear reaction shot from Rick, a man who has personally witnessed interdimensional horrors on a near weekly basis for years, retching hard enough that the moment plays as plainly out of character for him specifically. You get an even starker reaction from Jerry, the family member least equipped to handle real information, breaking down in a way none of his other humiliations across the whole series come close to matching. And then nothing, no dialogue explaining it, no follow-up scene, no future episode where either of them so much as references what they saw. Most mysteries here give you fragments to assemble. This one gives you 2 data points and then slams the door before you can use them for anything, which might be exactly why it has stuck with so many viewers longer than mysteries the writers actually spent years building toward. A gentler kind of unresolved thread belongs to Mr. Nimbus, who first turns up in Mort Dinner Rick Andre, the season 5 premiere from 2021, presenting himself as a kind of self-appointed king of the ocean, an Atlantis-adjacent monarch built as an affectionate parody of the Marvel character Namor, voiced by Dan Harmon himself. He and Rick share an obvious history the moment they are in a room together, a rivalry telegraphed through tone and body language rather than exposition, the two of them needling each other with the specific, worn comfort of men who have clashed before and expect to clash again. What actually caused that rivalry, what history sits underneath the friction, has never been explained on screen. There is a comic tie-in that gestures at some backstory, but comics in this franchise sit outside the show's confirmed continuity, treated as supplementary material rather than canon, so I would rather not hand you an answer sourced from a medium the show itself does not fully endorse. On screen, where the actual continuity lives, Mr. Nimbus and Rick simply already dislike each other when we meet them, fully formed, the way old rivalries in real life often just already exist by the time you are old enough to notice them, without anyone ever quite explaining how they started. I actually like that this particular mystery gets so little weight put on it. Not every rivalry in a person's life needs an origin scene to feel real, and there is something oddly comforting about watching 2 grown men bicker with total, easy familiarity over a history the audience is never let in on. The way you might watch 2 old acquaintances at a party needle each other over some story you were clearly never told and have long since stopped expecting to hear. Mr. Nimbus does not need his rivalry with Rick explained to function as a character. He needs it to feel lived in, and it does, which might be the whole reason nobody ever bothered to look closer at where it started. The last of these smaller, contained mysteries I want to spend real time on is one of the purely inventive high points this show has ever built for a single episode, and it resolves entirely on its own terms without leaving any thread hanging afterward, which makes it different in kind from almost everything else here. Never Ricking Morty, the 6th episode of season 4, traps Rick and Morty aboard something called the Story Train, an entire vehicle built as a literalized metaphor for narrative structure itself, run by a character called the Story Lord, voiced by Paul Giamatti, whose whole purpose is farming Rick and Morty's adventures as raw material, forcing them through a predetermined sequence of dramatic beats designed to produce satisfying, marketable stories against their will. It is about as directly self-aware as the series has ever allowed itself to be. An episode explicitly about the mechanics of storytelling dressed up as a runaway train Rick cannot simply blow his way out of, because the train's entire design anticipates exactly that kind of solution and folds it into another beat in its story engine. Rick's actual escape is the funniest and most pointed part of the whole conceit. Rather than outthinking the story lord with more science, the one move a show about a mad scientist would train you to expect, Rick escapes by praying sincerely to Jesus, leading Morty in prayer until an impossibly muscular Jesus Christ literally shows up and overpowers the story lord. The move works precisely because it is so far outside the kind of narrative logic the story train was built to anticipate and absorb. A beat so uncharacteristic and so narratively worthless that it drains the whole machine of the marketable drama it runs on. It breaks the system by refusing to be a good story at all. The episode stands completely on its own, a self-contained piece of formal experimentation, never directly revisited or referenced again, and I do not think it needs to be. Some ideas are better left exactly where they land the first time. Bird Person's story is different from everything else in this grab bag because it is not really a single unanswered question so much as a character who keeps getting pulled back from the edge of the story's finality without it ever fully explaining how, and by now his relationship with death has become strange enough to deserve tracing from the beginning. Bird Person is introduced as one of Rick's oldest friends, a war buddy with real history behind their friendship, the kind of bond rarely extended to anyone in Rick's orbit besides Morty. That friendship gets tested and ultimately shattered in The Wedding Squanchers, the season 2 finale, when Bird Person marries Tammy, a character who turns out to be an undercover Galactic Federation agent who had been using the relationship as a long con. At the wedding itself, once her cover is blown, Tammy shoots and kills Bird Person in front of the assembled guests. A brutal beat to end a season on, made worse by how much sincerity had been built into that wedding only minutes earlier. For a while, that death read as final, the kind of loss this series does not usually walk back. It did not stay final for long. In the post-credit scene of The Rick Shank Rickdemption, the season 3 premiere we have returned to several times tonight for entirely different reasons, Bird Person is revealed to have survived, rebuilt as a cyborg, his organic body augmented and replaced with mechanical systems extensive enough to earn him an entirely new identity to go with the new body, Phoenix Person. The transformation reads less like a miracle and more like being salvaged, put back together out of necessity rather than choice. And the discomfort of that gets leaned into rather than played as a triumphant return. Phoenix Person does not come back as an ally either. He returns as an antagonist, his loyalties and personality altered enough by whatever process rebuilt him that the friendship he once had with Rick no longer functions the way it used to. That antagonism plays out until Starmort Rickturn of the Jerry, the season 4 finale, the same episode that confirmed Beth's clone status and introduced Space Beth in full, where Space Beth is the one who finally shuts Phoenix Person down. The word choice there matters. This is framed as a shutdown, a deactivation, not the definitive, unambiguous death that Bird Person's original shooting was. Given everything we already know about how casually technology reverses death in this universe, that distinction is not a small one. By the time we reach season 7, Bird Person is alive again, no longer operating as Phoenix Person, back to something close to his old self and raising a daughter he rescues from a galactic prison. The broad strokes of how he got there are on screen. The deactivated Phoenix Person was salvaged by the Smith family, kept for a stretch in Rick's garage lab, and eventually restored by Rick to something like the person he used to be. The finer mechanics of that restoration stay light on detail, and I would rather not dress the gaps up as a confident step-by-step account because the episodes themselves do not hand me one. What I can tell you plainly is the shape of the whole arc. He dies, he is rebuilt as something harder and more dangerous. That version is shut down rather than killed outright, and some years later he is alive again, softer again, a father again, doing right by his family the way the original Bird Person always seemed built to do before Tammy's betrayal knocked him off that path. Whatever the exact steps between a deactivated cyborg and a living father, plenty of them were left implied rather than spelled out, and I would rather tell you that honestly than invent the missing pieces just to make this section feel more complete than it actually is. What I keep noticing about Bird Person's whole arc is how much it resembles Rick's. Structurally, even though the two men end up in very different emotional places, by the time their stories catch up to the present, both are defined by a devastating loss inflicted by someone who used intimacy as a weapon against them. Rick by an alternate version of himself. Bird Person by a spouse working undercover the entire time. Both get rebuilt, in different senses, by grief and technology working together. And both eventually land somewhere quieter than where their darkest chapter left them, though Bird Person gets there with far less screen time and far less explanation than Rick ever did. It is one of the clearer examples on this whole list of Rick and Morty trusting you to accept an emotional through line even when it withholds the connective plot tissue that would normally justify it. I also think Bird Person's story works as a quiet rebuttal to the idea that every rebuilt or resurrected character here is cheap, a reset button pressed to dodge real consequence. Phoenix Person was not a costless resurrection. He came back altered, hostile, estranged from the one friendship that had defined him, and he had to earn his way back to something resembling his original self across real narrative time, rather than getting it handed to him the moment the plot needed a happy ending. Compare that to how casually alternate Ricks die throughout the Citadel's two collapses. Barely mourned, barely named. Bird Person's resurrection cost him years of his own story, his own personality, his own closeness with Rick before any of it came back. And I think that cost is exactly what keeps his arc from feeling like a cheat. Even though, on paper, a man who died at his own wedding and is walking around alive by the end could easily read as one. There is one more piece of Rick's story left to cover, and I have saved it for last on purpose because it is recent, it directly involves Diane, and it happens to correct a detail that gets misremembered constantly, badly enough that I want to walk through exactly what happens rather than assume you already have it right. Fear No Mort, the Season 7 finale, aired in December of 2023, and it centers on something called a fear hole, discovered in typically undignified fashion inside the bathroom of an alien Denny's. The premise is straightforward and unsettling in equal measure. Step into the hole and it shows you your greatest fear in a form vivid and immersive enough that confronting it properly, rather than simply enduring it, is the only way out. It is worth being precise about who actually goes in, because this is the detail that gets scrambled most often when people describe the episode secondhand. Morty is the one who enters the fear hole, not Rick. Rick comes right up to the edge of it, tempted, genuinely tempted, in a moment played with real weight because the trick the hole uses to draw him in is Diane, appearing to him as a hallucination inside the hole's influence, dangling exactly the kind of reunion we spent an entire earlier stretch of tonight establishing has been permanently, structurally foreclosed. Rick, standing right at that threshold, chooses not to step through. He declines the illusion, even knowing what it is offering him, even knowing how badly some part of him clearly wants it. Morty is the one who actually goes in, and what waits for him inside is not a monster or a memory of physical danger, the kind of fear you might expect from a teenager who has been dragged through interdimensional violence for years. His deepest fear turns out to be Rick abandoning him, plainly, directly, the abandonment itself rather than anything more elaborate or metaphorical standing in for it. Confronting that fear, honestly, sitting inside it rather than fleeing from it, is what finally lets him climb back out. The episode has one more turn of the screw waiting too. When the two of them seem to make it home, another Rick steps through a portal carrying Diane, alive, from the day she died, and only then does it land that they never actually left the hole at all, that the apparent escape was just one more layer of the fear it was staging. It is an unexpectedly devastating piece of characterization once you actually think about it. After years of episodes built around Rick's trauma, Rick's grief, Rick's dead wife, the rawest, least guarded emotional beat gets handed to Morty instead, and gets to be about him for once, about what living inside Rick's orbit for years has actually done to a kid who started this whole series as an anxious, ordinary teenager, and has since watched his grandfather nearly step into a hallucination of his own murdered wife rather than stay present with him. I want to be direct about why I'm spending real time getting this detail exactly right, rather than treating it as a minor footnote. Rick did not enter the fear hole. That specific claim, that Rick walked into it himself, circulates online with enough confidence that it is worth stating the correct version plainly and moving on. Morty enters it, Rick is tempted by a manufactured vision of Diane and chooses not to, and the fear that actually gets confronted and overcome in the episode belongs to Morty, not to his grandfather. Getting a detail like that backwards does not just misstate a plot point, it inverts the entire emotional argument the finale is making, trading a story about Morty's specific, hard-won courage for a completely different story about Rick's grief that the episode in this instance is not actually telling. Sitting a little further back from the mechanics of the episode, what Fear No Mort does structurally is echo something we have already spent a long time on tonight, deliberately, I think. Rick is offered a version of Diane again, framed as an illusion this time rather than a genuine possibility, and his refusal to step into it works as confirmation of exactly how much emotional ground he has actually covered since that garage memory first appeared back in Season 3. He does not need reminding that Diane is gone. He already knows. The temptation is real, and there's no pretending otherwise, but the refusal is real too. And by Season 7, refusal is apparently something Rick Sanchez has finally become capable of, at least in this one specific, carefully constructed moment. The last of these smaller mysteries takes the shape of a gadget rather than a person, and it might be the single cleverest bait and switch this show has ever pulled on its own audience, precisely because of how ordinary the setup sounds before the trick reveals itself. The Vat of Acid episode, the 8th episode of Season 4, opens with Rick handing Morty what looks, on its face, like the ultimate safety net, a remote device Rick describes as a save point, the kind of thing you would recognize instantly from a video game, letting Morty mark a moment in time and rewind back to it if a later choice goes badly. Morty, predictably, uses it recklessly, treating consequence-free decision-making as license to behave exactly the way a teenager handed a cheat code would. A lot of that recklessness gets pointed at a girl he likes, restarting the same encounter again and again until it finally goes the way he wants it to, which curdles into something much darker in hindsight. Once you understand what every restart actually was, a fresh timeline entered over the body of another Morty, who had his own version of that same night still ahead of him. And then the rug comes out from under both Morty and the audience at the same time. The device was never actually rewinding time at all. What it does instead is far stranger and, once you sit with the implications, considerably darker. Each time Morty presses it, he is not undoing his own timeline. He is teleporting into a neighboring, near-identical dimension at the exact moment he wants to return to. And in order to take that dimension's version of himself, he has to kill that other Morty first, cleanly and without ceremony, to make room for his own arrival. The save point was never a rewind button. It was a serial displacement machine dressed up as a mercy. By the end of the episode, once Morty finally understands what he has actually been doing this whole time, a reckoning gets forced. The dimensions he has been hopping through and discarding get merged back together into a single timeline. And the memories of everything he did across all of those parallel Morty's lives collapse into him at once, a flood of consequence he can no longer selectively erase or escape. It is one of the more purely conceptual half hours the series has ever built, taking a mechanic that sounds, on the surface, like standard science fiction wish fulfillment, the ability to undo your mistakes, and revealing it instead as a metaphor for exactly the opposite. The idea that consequences do not actually disappear just because you found a clever enough way to stop looking at them. To my knowledge, the device never comes back, and this specific storyline never gets referenced again in a later episode, which fits the pattern we have now seen a few times tonight, of Rick and Morty building an entire, fully worked out concept for a single, self-contained hour, and then simply retiring it, confident the idea landed and does not need a sequel to justify its existence. It is worth noticing how closely this premise rhymes with the very first mystery we covered tonight, even though the line between them never gets drawn on screen. Morty displacing a nearly identical version of himself to escape a mistake is, structurally, the exact same move Rick made back in Rick Potion number 9, fleeing a ruined world to step into a family that had just lost its own Rick and Morty unnoticed. The difference is entirely in how each generation of the family understands what it did afterward. Rick got away with it clean, no reckoning, no merged memories forcing him to sit with the cost. Just a new life picked up as though the old one's replacement never happened. Morty does not get that mercy. He is made to carry every version of himself he displaced, all their choices flooding into one head at once. And I do not think that difference is an accident. It reads like the writing correcting itself one generation later without ever admitting that is what it is doing. For the exact same escape it let Rick walk away from clean. What I like most about this particular one, turning it over again, is how precisely it answers a question almost every viewer of a show like this eventually asks without quite saying it out loud. If characters in this universe can access alternate dimensions this freely, why does anything ever actually matter? The Vat of Acid episode answers that directly inside its own premise, by showing you a character who tries to use dimensional access as a way of escaping consequence entirely, and then making him personally responsible, in the bluntest way it can stage, for every life he stepped over to do it. It is a small, contained argument against the exact kind of thinking the premise would otherwise seem to invite, and I think that tension between a multiverse that offers infinite outs and a story that keeps insisting those outs cost something real is close to the actual thesis running underneath almost everything we have talked about tonight. Now that we have gone through all of it, the origin story and the clone and the eye-patched president and the government built out of duplicate old men and the divorce and the superhero massacre and the ex-girlfriend who assimilates whole populations and the reptilian family friend and the cat and the sea king and the story train and the man who would not step into a hallucination of his dead wife and the boy who did step into his own worst fear, it is worth laying all of it out next to each other and asking what actually separates one kind of unsolved mystery from another, because they are not all unsolved for the same reason, and treating them as though they were would flatten exactly what makes this show worth thinking about this carefully in the first place. Some of what we walked through was never really a mystery in the strict sense at all, just a slow burn reveal, information always meant to arrive eventually and simply delayed for maximum weight. Rick Prime belongs here. Who killed Diane was known from the moment that garage scene got written into season 3, and the wait of 4 years to hand you the name, the motive, and the ending is exactly what made the eventual payoff land as hard as it did. Bird Person's long, strange path from death to cyborg to shutdown to quiet fatherhood belongs in something like this category too. Information clearly worked out in the show's own internal logic, even if large stretches of that path got left off screen, thin and undersourced rather than walked through step by mechanical step. Then there is a second, much rarer category, the mysteries the writers have said, outright they intend to keep forever. Beth's clone status is the clearest example, and it is worth restating precisely because so few shows this long-running have the discipline to actually stick to a decision like that once the audience starts begging for an answer. This is not a case of nobody having settled on which Beth is real. The not knowing is the entire architecture of the story, deliberately built so that neither Beth, nor Rick, nor anyone watching at home ever gets to rank one of them above the other. Mr. Poopybuthole's species sits right alongside it, a mystery that keeps getting actively deepened rather than resolved, most recently with that molecular mismatch in the Season 8 finale, which tells you plainly that nobody involved in making this has any intention of ever handing you a tidy answer there either. A third category is smaller and stranger still, the mysteries that are not being withheld at all, that were simply never meant to have an answer beyond the scene itself. The unnamed cat's mind scan belongs here entirely on its own. There is no future episode building toward an explanation of what Rick and Jerry saw, because answering that particular question was never the plan. The scene is complete exactly as written, two men broken by something we will never see, and a cat that tells us essentially to stop looking for more. Mr. Nimbus's rivalry with Rick belongs in a softer version of the same category, an established fact of the world, presented the way old grudges actually work between people who have known each other a long time, without an origin story attached because most real feuds do not come with one either. And then there is a fourth category, the one Evil Morty currently occupies, which is simply unfinished. Not deliberately withheld the way Beth's clone status is, not naturally answer-free the way the cat scene is, just plainly in progress. an arc still being actively written, with an arrest that happened only a couple of months before this recording, and a finale to the current season that, as of the day I am putting this together, has not aired yet. I would rather be honest about that boundary because it is an easy one to blur when you are trying to sound authoritative about a show that is still adding new episodes while you are talking about it. Anything past what has actually aired is outside what any of us can respond to yet, and there is no sense pretending otherwise just to give this a cleaner ending than the show itself has provided. Running underneath all four of these categories, and this is the part I keep landing on whenever I sit down to actually think through the show as a whole rather than episode by episode, is a kind of respect for the audience that a lot of serialized television does not risk anymore. Most shows this size have learned to treat every dangling thread as a promise, something the audience is owed a return on eventually, because that is what keeps people watching season after season. Rick and Morty treats some threads as promises and some as declarations, and it trusts you to tell the difference without holding your hand through it, which is a much harder needle to thread than it sounds, and one it threads more often than it probably gets credit for. There is a dry, almost funny symmetry in the fact that the production history has ended up mirroring its favorite theme without anyone planning it that way. A story fixated on originals and replacements, on whether a person can stop being who they were and still count as the same person underneath, spent its first 6 seasons voiced by one man playing both of its leads, and then, after his departure from the production following the domestic violence allegations that became public in early 2023, had to answer in the real world a version of the exact question it keeps asking its characters. Could this still be Rick and Morty with different voices behind Rick and Morty? Ian Cardone and Harry Belden inherited 2 of the most distinctive, heavily memed vocal performances in modern animation, and did it well enough that a huge portion of the audience settled into the new voices within a season or 2, which is its own quiet vindication of everything the writing has spent years arguing through its plots. That identity is not actually housed in some irreplaceable original. That continuity is something a character or a performance or a family can carry forward even after the specific vessel carrying it gets swapped out. I do not think that is a coincidence worth reading too much into as some kind of deliberate authorial statement, because it plainly was not planned that way. It was a real, difficult, unwanted transition forced on the production from outside. But it lines up with the whole world view closely enough that it is hard not to notice, and worth naming plainly rather than pretending the real-world history exists in some separate box from the fiction it produces. I want to spend a minute on why a show built this deliberately around unanswered questions has managed to stay this culturally present for over a decade, because I do not think it is simply a matter of good jokes, even though the jokes are frequently very good. Plenty of shows are funny, plenty of shows build an ambitious multiverse. What Rick and Morty does that fewer of them manage is treat ambiguity as a feature worth defending rather than a flaw to be apologized for. Modern television, especially the kind built around mystery, tends to over-explain itself out of a fear that the audience will feel cheated otherwise, handing you flashback after flashback until every gap gets filled, whether the story needed it filled or not. Rick and Morty consistently bets the opposite way, that a well-placed silence does more work than an explanation would, that Mr. Poopybutthole is more interesting unexplained than explained, that Beth's identity means more precisely because nobody, including the character herself, gets to resolve it. That is an unusual position for a long-running show to hold on to for this many years, under this much pressure from an audience that, by nature, wants answers. And the fact that the writers have held that line as consistently as they have is, to me, what impresses me most about how the show has been run behind the scenes. More impressive, honestly, than any individual twist we covered tonight. None of which is to say every choice lands, or that every open thread is open on purpose rather than simply unfinished business nobody has circled back to. A few of the things we walked through, the Citadel's current leadership, Bird Person's exact path back to fatherhood, sit in a genuine gray zone between deliberate ambiguity and material that just has not been addressed directly. And I do not think it does the show any favors to pretend every gap is a masterstroke. Some gaps are just gaps. Part of what makes this worth returning to, though, is that even its genuine gaps tend to sit comfortably alongside its intentional ones, because the whole tone already trains you not to expect wall-to-wall explanation in the first place. A plot hole in a story obsessed with tidy resolution stands out like a missing tooth. A plot hole in one this content to leave things unresolved barely registers as different from everything around it. If there is one thread that ties everything we have gone through tonight together, more than the multiverse mechanics or the running jokes or the specific episode titles, it is that the show keeps circling the same handful of questions from every possible angle without ever pretending any one answer settles the matter for good. Who counts as the real version of a person? What a family actually owes each other once you introduce doubles and clones and rebuilt bodies and secretly swap dimensions into the mix? Whether grief, once it has reshaped a person as completely as it reshaped Rick, can ever fully let go of what caused it, or whether the healthiest version of moving on still keeps a small, deliberate room for what was lost. None of those questions get answered in some final, philosophical sense, and I do not think anyone making it particularly wants them to be. What it does instead, episode after episode, mystery after mystery, is show you a family finding ways to keep living inside those unanswered questions without being destroyed by them, which might be a more useful thing for a television show to model than an answer would have been anyway. I want to double back to Rick himself for a moment, now that we have all the other mysteries laid out around him, because there is a version of this whole story that only comes into focus once you stop looking at any single reveal in isolation and start looking at the shape all of it makes together. Every major mystery we covered tonight touches Rick somewhere directly or at a slight remove. And once you notice that, a pattern starts to surface that no single episode states outright, but that the accumulation makes hard to miss. Almost everyone close to Rick eventually ends up managing some version of his damage rather than simply being loved by him in an uncomplicated way. Diane died because of a decision Rick made about who he wanted to be. Beth exists in permanent duplicate partly because Rick could not bring himself to make her choose, the way his own choice had once been made for him by someone else's cruelty. Unity left because loving him meant absorbing consequences that were never really hers to carry. Bird Person's entire second act, cyborg and antagonist and eventual quiet father, traces back to a friendship close enough to Rick's orbit that it became collateral in somebody else's war against him. Even Morty, dragged through the fear hole in that season 7 finale, discovers that his deepest fear is not danger or death, but Rick leaving, which means the defining anxiety of his adolescence is not something that happened to him independently. It is something Rick's own pattern of behavior planted there over years of adventures that always end the same way, with Rick pulling away right before things get too real. None of that makes Rick a villain in any simple sense, and I do not think you are meant to read it that way either. It makes him something closer to what he actually is, a man whose worst day reorganized the rest of his life around never having another one like it, at the cost of everyone who loves him having to build their own relationship to that reorganization, whether they signed up for it or not. That reading does not excuse the cruelty, the drinking, the way he treats Jerry, the way he occasionally treats Morty like a tool rather than a grandson. It just locates the cruelty inside a cause rather than treating it as free-floating personality, and I think that is ultimately the argument this whole mystery structure has been building toward across every one of the threads we spent tonight untangling. You are not asked to forgive Rick. You are asked to understand the shape of the wound well enough that his behavior stops reading as random and starts reading as consistent, almost mathematically so, once you have the full picture in front of you the way we do now. There is a broader thread here too, one that reaches past Rick specifically into how this show treats disposability as a running idea. And once you have it in your head, it becomes hard to unsee across nearly everything we have covered tonight. The Citadel treats Mortis as an interchangeable underclass. The Vindicators die in a single episode with barely a beat of mourning attached. Alternate Ricks die by the hundreds in a collision Rick himself engineered and barely reacts to. Even the wider approach to death across the multiverse treats most individual lives as replaceable in a purely structural sense. Since somewhere out past the edge of what we ever see, there is very likely another version of nearly every character we have grown attached to. And yet the mysteries that actually matter, the ones given real seasons to build, are always about the exceptions to that rule. The handful of people whose specific, irreplaceable version of themselves the story refuses to treat as interchangeable with any copy. Diane cannot be replaced by another Diane, which is precisely why her death has to be permanent and total rather than just another swappable loss. Beth's two versions cannot be ranked against each other because doing so would mean treating one of them as disposable in exactly the way the Citadel treats its own Mortys, and the writing has apparently decided, at the level of its own values, that it will not do that to a character it actually cares about. Held up against each other, the casual, multiversal body count and the fierce protectiveness over a small handful of specific, named relationships stop looking like a contradiction and start looking like the whole point. Infinite versions of everyone exist, and almost none of it matters except for the exact handful of bonds the story insists on treating as singular anyway. It is worth talking briefly about what it actually does to an audience to be handed mysteries built this way, spaced out across years rather than episodes, because I do not think the effect on the people watching gets discussed nearly as much as the mysteries themselves do. A show that resolves its questions within a season trains its audience to expect closure on a predictable schedule. One that lets a single unanswered detail from a 6th episode sit untouched for the better part of a decade trains its audience toward something closer to patience, or maybe toward a specific, low-grade, pleasurable suspicion that runs under every subsequent episode. This detail might matter later, or it might not, and there is no way to know which from where you are currently sitting. That uncertainty is, I think, most of what has kept fan communities so active for so long. Online discussion has spent years relitigating exactly the kinds of questions we spent tonight working through, whether Rick Prime was the real culprit long before it got confirmed, whether Beth would ever get a definitive clone reveal, what Mr. Poopybutthole actually is underneath the nickname. Most of those conversations never resolved into a single agreed-upon answer, because the writers were in no hurry to hand one over, and there is something warm about an entire audience spending years collectively unsure about the same handful of things, checking back in with each new season the way you might check in on an old, ongoing argument with a friend, less interested in winning it than in seeing where it goes next. That kind of communal, unresolved attention is a strange thing to build a fandom around, compared to how most franchises try to keep an audience engaged, usually through steady scheduled payoff. A mystery introduced and solved within a predictable window so the audience always has something fresh to celebrate. Rick and Morty asked for something closer to patience without a deadline attached, and it is worth acknowledging that this approach does not work for everyone. Plenty of viewers understandably find that kind of open-ended structure frustrating rather than rewarding, and there is nothing wrong with wanting your television to actually resolve what it raises. But for the audience willing to sit with the alternative, it has built something rarer than a well-plotted mystery box, a genuine, sustained relationship with its own uncertainty, one that rewards exactly the kind of long, slow attention a night like this is built to encourage. That loosely organized theorizing culture only works, though, if the show occasionally rewards it. And Rick and Morty has been careful, across its whole run, to make sure the reward comes often enough to keep the pattern alive without coming so often that it stops feeling earned. Every few seasons, one of these long, simmering questions gets an actual answer. Rick Prime's identity, the confirmation that Beth was cloned, even if not which one, the eye patch's real function, and each time it happens, it validates years of collective attention in a single episode, which is a very specific kind of payoff, different from the payoff of a show that answers its questions on a tighter, more predictable cycle. It rewards exactly the viewer who stuck around, who kept paying attention during the seasons where nothing seemed to be moving forward on a particular thread, and it does that without ever promising, up front, that the patience would definitely be worth it. That is a legitimately risky way to build a long-running show, because it depends entirely on trust the writers have to earn and keep earning across years of real time, and it would only take one badly handled reveal, one payoff that felt cheap or rushed after all that waiting, to burn a huge amount of the goodwill this particular structure depends on. As far as I can tell, watching the whole run back-to-back the way putting a video like this together requires, that trust has mostly held. The reveals we covered tonight, taken as a set, tend to land with more weight than their actual screen time would suggest, precisely because of how long the wait was and how little got promised along the way. Watching a show like this across more than a decade also changes your relationship to the characters in a way worth naming plainly before we close out. Morty starts the series as an anxious, mostly reactive kid, dragged along on adventures he barely understands and rarely enjoys. And by the time you reach the fear hole in the season 7 finale, he has become someone capable of walking directly into his own worst fear and getting himself back out the other side without his grandfather's help. Beth starts out defined almost entirely by her frustration with Jerry and her unexamined resentment toward the life she settled into, and by the time both versions of her share a household without either one needing to win an argument about which is more real, she has become someone capable of a kind of peace her earlier seasons gave you no real reason to expect. Rick, for all his talk about nihilism and the meaninglessness of any given choice in an infinite multiverse, spends the entire run making choices that only make sense if some things actually do matter more than others to him. And the mysteries we spent tonight tracing are largely the record of him slowly, reluctantly, admitting that to himself and to the people around him. None of these characters arrive anywhere resembling a finished, resolved state, and there has never been any suggestion they will. But they are all, without much ceremony, further along than where they started, and I think that slow, cumulative motion, more than any single reveal, is the actual reward for having sat with this show for as long as many of you probably have. Even the smaller characters carry some version of that same slow motion, if you know where to look for it. Jerry goes from a man whose own parents openly embarrassed him to a man capable of building an unconventional household of his own without falling apart under the weight of it. Unity goes from someone who simply left to someone willing to come back and ask, directly, whether the man she left actually changed, which is its own kind of growth even if she never gets a satisfying answer. Even Bird Person, dragged through the single, strangest, most fragmented arc on this entire list, ends up somewhere gentler than where Tammy's betrayal left him. None of it resolves cleanly, and none of it was ever going to, on a story this content, to leave real threads open. But movement without resolution still counts as movement, and I think that is easy to miss when you are following any one of these characters episode by episode rather than laying the whole decade out at once, the way tonight asked you to. Even Mr. Poopybutthole, who never seems to move at all, whose entire personality is a kind of stillness the rest of the family orbits, ends up serving the same function for everyone else without ever trying to, a fixed point they can all measure their own movement against, whether anyone intended him that way or not. Before we close out, it feels worth taking stock of exactly where all of this stands right now, at the specific moment this is being put together, because a show still actively airing new episodes does not hold still, just because we have finished talking about it. Rick Prime is dead, permanently as far as the writers and the audience are concerned, and Diane remains gone from every version of every reality that exists, with only the private, mind-bound comfort of Memory Diane left in her place. Beth's clone status remains exactly as unresolved as it has been since the cloning was first confirmed, with both versions of her currently alive, currently reconciled, and currently uninterested as characters in ever finding out which of them carries the original claim. Evil Morty sits in custody, arrested by the time cops after more than a decade of staying one step ahead of everyone in his orbit. And whether that arrest holds, whether it is the actual end of his story or simply the latest turn in it, is a question the still airing current season has not finished answering as of this recording. The Citadel of Ricks exists in some rebuilt, imperfect form, governed by fragments and rumors more than by anything shown to us directly, twice destroyed and apparently twice willing to rebuild itself anyway. Mr. Poopybutthole is married to no one now, divorced, heartbroken, and biologically unclassifiable, with a molecular structure that reportedly does not even match his own home dimension, which is either the strangest joke this show has ever committed to or the closest thing to a real clue it has ever offered, and there is honestly no way to know which from where we are sitting. Jerry, Beth, and Space Beth continue living together in whatever this family's version of a conventional household looks like now. 3 adults who have each, in their own way, stopped pretending the shape of a family has to look like anything in particular to actually function. Unity is out there somewhere, unconvinced, waiting to see if Rick's claim that he has changed turns out to be true over a longer stretch of time than one intense conversation could ever prove. And Bird Person is alive, a father again, carrying a history nobody has ever fully walked us through, and based on everything else we now know about how this show handles its most important relationships, probably never will in full detail. Out past all of that, in the human, non-Rick corner of this universe, President Andre Curtis remains in office, still unrelated to any of the multiversal chaos, and popular enough as a character that Adult Swim has gone and built him his own spin-off, a small, strange sign that even the most incidental figures in this world keep finding their own way into its wider cultural life. Laid out like that, in one place, it is a striking amount of unresolved material for any show to be carrying at once. And I want to resist the urge to call that a flaw because I do not actually think it is one. A show this many years into its run, with this much accumulated history, could very reasonably have started tying off loose ends by now, delivering tidy epilogues for its major relationships, the way long-running shows often do once they sense themselves approaching some kind of natural conclusion. Rick and Morty has, instead, kept generating new open questions at roughly the same rate it resolves old ones, which tells you something about how the people making it actually think about endings. They do not appear to trust them very much, or at least they do not appear to trust the idea that a story about a family this strange, this damaged, this multiversally complicated, could ever really be finished the way a tidier show might promise you it eventually would be. I find that more honest than frustrating, most of the time, though I will admit there are nights, working through a list like the one we just went through together, where I do wish someone would just tell me, plainly, which Beth is real. But then I remember that wishing for the answer and actually wanting it handed to me are not quite the same thing. And I'm not sure I actually want it, not really. Not if getting it meant giving up everything the not knowing currently protects. That contradiction, wanting an answer and at the same time hoping never to receive it, might be the truest way to describe how it feels to be a longtime fan of a show, built this deliberately around its own unresolved questions, and I suspect most of you listening tonight already know exactly that feeling without needing me to spell it out. One last thing worth dwelling on before we let this go for the night is how strange it is that a show built on fart jokes and vomit and testicle monsters ended up being the vehicle for grief this specific and this well-constructed. That combination is not an accident, and I do not think it is even really a contradiction, though it can feel like one the first time you notice how far apart the silliest and saddest registers actually sit within a single half hour. Comedy, especially the loud, crude, structurally chaotic kind traded in here, works partly by lowering an audience's guard. You laugh at Rick vomiting on himself, at Mr. Poopybutthole's name, at a whole episode built around a sentient train car, and that laughter does something to your attention a straightforwardly dramatic show could never quite manage. It convinces you, moment to moment, that nothing currently on screen is going to ask very much of you emotionally. Rick and Morty exploits that lowered guard constantly, and on purpose. The garage memory arrives inside an episode about a Federation prison break. The fear hole arrives inside an episode that opens on a Denny's bathroom joke. Bird Person's death arrives at a wedding the whole episode had spent playing for genuine warmth and comedy in equal measure. None of the heaviest reveals get a musical cue announcing themselves in advance. No swelling score, no slow zoom, no dialogue telegraphing importance the way a more conventional drama would stage the exact same beat. They just happen inside the same tonal register as everything around them, and the whiplash of that placement is, I think, most of why these moments land as hard as they do. You are not braced for them. You have spent the previous 20 minutes being actively trained not to be. I think that structural choice is also why so many of these mysteries survive as long as they do without feeling like stalling. A more self-serious drama that sat on a question for 4 seasons would eventually start to feel evasive, like it was withholding an answer because it did not actually have one yet. Rick and Morty gets away with the same length of delay because the delay never reads as its primary mode. It reads as an occasional buried seam running underneath 100 other things that are actively, loudly happening in every episode along the way. You are not sitting there for 4 years, staring directly at an unanswered question. You are watching an ongoing, very funny show that happens to be building toward something in the background, and the something only fully announces itself once it finally arrives. There is also something worth naming about how this tonal strategy treats its audience's intelligence, because it assumes you are capable of holding a joke and a real wound in the same scene without needing constant clarification about which one you are supposed to be feeling. A lot of comedy that reaches for real emotional weight ends up either undercutting its own sincerity with a joke immediately after the sincere beat, as if embarrassed to have meant something, or dropping the comedy entirely for the duration of the serious material, cordoning grief off into its own separate, clearly labeled zone. Rick and Morty mostly refuses both of those instincts. The garage memory sits inside a chaotic prison break with no apology for either half of that combination. Fear No Mort gets its Denny's bathroom joke and its abandonment trauma in the same episode, sometimes in the same scene, without one canceling out the other. I think that refusal to separate the two registers is part of what makes the mysteries land as legitimately felt rather than as tacked-on prestige seriousness, bolted onto a comedy for credibility's sake. The silliness is not a mask pulled off when it is time to take something seriously. The silliness and the grief are the same show, all the way through, and I happen to think that is the harder, better way to build a story like this one. There is a smaller pattern hiding inside everything we have covered tonight that I want to point out before we finish, because once you see it, it becomes one of the more useful ways to understand how the show actually builds its biggest moments, and it has nothing to do with plot mechanics at all. Nearly every one of the mysteries we walk through is anchored to a small, unglamorous, almost embarrassingly ordinary physical location, rather than to some grand, cosmic backdrop you might assume a show this obsessed with the scale of the multiverse would reach for. Diane and young Beth die in a family garage, the most mundane room a suburban house has to offer. Morty confronts the defining fear of his life inside the bathroom of an alien Denny's, a setting clearly chosen for how deliberately unglamorous it is. Beth's entire clone dilemma gets set in motion over what amounts to a strange, extended playdate with a childhood friend. The talking cat's unexplained revelation happens in the Smith family's own home, in a room we have otherwise watched them eat breakfast in a dozen times. Even Rick Prime's identity, the single biggest reveal ever built toward, gets delivered inside the frame of a bomb going off in that same unremarkable garage, not in some grand set-piece battle across dimensions. I think that choice is doing more work than it gets credit for. A show could easily stage its biggest reveals in its most visually extravagant settings, the Citadel at its most crowded, some cosmic battlefield stretching across the edge of the central finite curve, and plenty of stories built around a multiverse this large would default to exactly that instinct, treating scale as a substitute for weight. Rick and Morty tends to do the opposite, reserving its most extravagant settings for its jokes and its more disposable action, while routing its actual emotional cargo through the smallest, most recognizable rooms it has available. A garage, a bathroom, a kitchen table, a childhood friend's living room. It is a choice that keeps the mysteries feeling like they are happening to a family, specifically rather than to abstract cosmic forces moving through a family's general vicinity, and I think that grounding is a large part of why these particular reveals land as personally as they do, even wrapped inside a premise this absurd. You do not need the multiverse to understand what a garage explosion does to the people who survive it. Every viewer already has some working sense of what an ordinary room like that is supposed to mean to a family, which makes it a far more efficient tool for grief than any amount of cosmic scenery would be. I want to end with a thought experiment because it is the clearest way I know to explain why so much of what we covered tonight is better left the way it has been left, rather than being some kind of failure of nerve on the writer's part. Imagine for a second that the show sat down tomorrow and definitively told you which Beth is the clone. Picture the actual scene, some device confirms it, on screen, in dialogue, no ambiguity left standing. What would that scene actually buy the story? It would settle a factual question, certainly, and a huge amount of online discussion would finally have its answer. But it would also do something silently destructive to everything built around these two women, because the entire emotional architecture of their reconciliation depends on neither of them being ranked above the other. The moment one gets confirmed as the copy, every scene of the two of them getting along, sharing a household, sharing Jerry, sharing Summer and Morty, would retroactively read differently, tinted by an asymmetry the writing spent years deliberately refusing to establish. The reveal would not just answer a question, it would undo, without announcing it, the actual argument several seasons of writing had been making. The same logic applies, in a smaller way, to Mr. Poopybutthole. Picture the scene where Federation scientists finally hand you his species, his home dimension, his full slot in the show's cosmology. It would be a fun trivia answer. It would also strip away the one thing that currently makes him work as a kind of emotional anchor for the audience, the sense that you can love someone completely without needing his file fully filled out first. Some mysteries, once you actually imagine their answers played out on screen, reveal themselves as questions that were only ever valuable while still open, the way a held note in music only means something for as long as it has not yet resolved. Not every question on this list works that way, and I do not want to overstate the argument into something it is not. Rick Prime's identity absolutely needed an answer eventually because the entire emotional architecture of Rick's character depended on the audience eventually learning what actually happened to Diane in the same blunt, factual way Rick himself eventually had to face it. Evil Morty's story may well need some kind of answer too, at some point once his arc has run its course. Though based on everything we have covered tonight, I would not bet heavily on that answer arriving quickly or arriving in a form that resolves as cleanly as fans might hope. The skill built into this whole identity is not simply refusing to answer things. It is knowing, mystery by mystery, which questions are actually load-bearing enough to need a resolution eventually, and which ones are stronger permanently for staying exactly as open as the day they were first asked. This kind of patient, deliberately incomplete storytelling has a history well outside animation, and it is worth placing Rick and Morty inside that broader tradition for a moment, because doing so clarifies what makes its specific approach unusual rather than just another example of the same trend. Mystery-driven television built its modern reputation on shows that dangled question after question across entire seasons, sometimes entire series, training audiences to treat every strange detail as a future puzzle piece. That style produced some legitimately great television, and it also produced a fair amount of audience burnout, because a show can only promise so many eventual payoffs before some of them start to feel less like patient craftsmanship and more like stalling dressed up as mystery. Rick and Morty sidesteps a lot of that fatigue by refusing to promise, up front, that everything strange within it is secretly a clue. Most of what happens in a given episode really is just what it looks like, a joke, a bit, a self-contained adventure with no bearing on anything that comes after it. The handful of threads that do matter get buried inside all of that noise rather than sitting apart from it, dressed up in the visual language a more conventional mystery show would use to signal importance. That difference is, I think, the real reason this one has avoided the kind of audience resentment that eventually catches up to shows, built more explicitly around long-term dangling questions. You are never quite sure, watching any given episode for the first time, whether what you just saw was meaningful or disposable, and it is entirely comfortable letting you sit in that uncertainty indefinitely rather than reassuring you either way. I keep returning in my own head to that flickering garage from the very start of tonight, the two versions of the same memory sitting on top of each other, one where a family survives an ordinary evening and one where it does not. That image turned out to be a kind of key for nearly everything we spent the last several hours working through together. Almost every thread we traced in one form or another asks the same underlying question that garage asks. Which version of this is real, and does it actually matter which one wins, once both versions have already shaped everything that came after them? Diane's death was real, and the fabricated version was a kindness Rick told himself for years before he could face otherwise. Both Beths are real, and the decision has been made permanently that ranking them against each other was never the point. Evil Morty's true origin might be a Rick in disguise, or it might be exactly what it appears to be. A Morty who simply refused to stay small, and we have never been told which, possibly because the answer is not thought to change what he actually did with the power he took. Mr. Poopybuthole's species is unknown, and the not knowing has never once affected how much this family clearly loves him. Over and over, across every single thread we covered tonight, the same argument keeps getting made in a dozen different disguises, that the true version of something matters far less than what the people around it decide to do with whatever version they actually have in front of them. That is, as best I can piece it together, the closest thing to a unifying answer this whole list actually has. And it is worth being honest that it is an answer built entirely out of interpretation rather than anything stated in so many words. Rick and Morty has never sat a character down and delivered that thesis as dialogue, the way a lesser show might feel the need to. It has simply built story after story that behaves as though the idea were true, letting the audience assemble the pattern for themselves out of a decade of scattered, half-buried evidence, which is, in its own way, exactly the kind of trust this whole video has been arguing the show extends to you constantly. I do not think that trust is unconditional or perfectly executed every time. There are threads on this list, the Citadel's current leadership, Bird Person's exact path back to a normal life, that feel less like intentional restraint and more like the ordinary gaps any long-running show accumulates simply by being long-running. But even those gaps sit comfortably inside a structure that has already trained you not to expect every question answered, which might be the most impressive trick the whole show has ever pulled off, and one it never once draws attention to, making its own incompleteness feel less like a flaw in the writing and more like an accurate description of what it actually feels like to know anyone, fictional or otherwise, for a very long time. It feels worth pointing out, before we close, just how much of what makes the current season interesting only becomes visible once you have the rest of this list sitting behind it. Taken in isolation, the Season 9 premiere is simply an Evil Morty episode, one more turn in a rivalry that has been running since the show's first year. Set against everything else we spent tonight tracing, though, it starts to look like several older threads converging on the same moment without announcing themselves as such. The weapon Evil Morty uses to blackmail Rick, that same Omega device category, capable of erasing a person and every variant of them across the whole multiverse at once, is not a new invention introduced for convenience. It is the exact class of weapon that already defined the worst thing that has ever happened to this family, the device Rick Prime used on Diane. Watching Evil Morty wield a version of that same technology against Rick directly, years after Rick finally got his revenge on the man who invented it, reframes the premiere as something closer to an echo than a fresh threat. The specific horror that built Rick's entire personality is still out there in different hands, still capable of doing to him exactly what it already did once before. There is also something worth noticing in the timing of it. Unity's return, only a couple of seasons earlier, was explicitly framed around her fear that Rick's obsession with Rick Prime was going to be the thing that finally destroyed whatever was left of him, and that conversation got left unresolved. Rick claiming he had changed, Unity unconvinced. The current season's premiere reveals that Rick has been secretly entangled with Evil Morty, keeping it hidden from everyone around him, allowing himself to be blackmailed rather than asking for help, which is not exactly the behavior of a man who has fully done the work Unity was hoping he had done. I do not think that earlier scene is being contradicted so much as extended without comment. Change, in this show's own terms, does not appear to be a single decision a character makes once and then simply holds on to forever. It looks more like a habit that has to be maintained under pressure, repeatedly, and Rick, even years removed from Rick Prime's death, still slips back into old patterns of secrecy and self-reliance the moment something threatens the people he has left. None of that resolves anything we do not already know about Rick, but it does suggest the current season is doing more structural work than a first watch might reveal, tying the Diane arc, the Evil Morty arc, and the Unity arc together into a single ongoing argument about whether a person shaped this thoroughly by one catastrophic loss can ever fully stop organizing his life around preventing a second one. The Time Cop's arrest of Evil Morty gives that argument a genuine turning point, the first time in over a decade that this specific antagonist has actually lost. But turning points are not endings, and I would rather not hand you a tidier read on where this is all going than the show itself has earned yet. What happens next, whether the still unaired finale of this season closes any of these threads further or opens new ones instead, is simply outside what any of us can speak to with confidence right now. Before we get to the end of the night properly, I want to address something that sits underneath this entire video, a kind of housekeeping question that matters more for a list built around mysteries than it would for almost any other kind of Rick and Morty video. And that is the question of what actually counts as the show telling you something versus something that merely sounds like it might have. We touched on this a few times tonight in passing, but it is worth gathering into one place. Rick and Morty exists inside a small ecosystem of adjacent material that is not the show itself. An anime spin-off produced by a separate studio telling its own alternate story in its own separate continuity. Solar Opposites, which shares a creator and nothing else. A long run of comics and a handful of licensed games. None of that material gets to answer a mystery for us tonight, no matter how tempting a specific detail from one of them might be. When I told you Mr. Nimbus's rivalry with Rick has never been explained on screen, that was true specifically of the show, the actual episodes, the only place this channel treats as a source of fact. There is a comic that gestures at more backstory for that rivalry, and I chose not to bring it into this video as an answer, because the show itself has never endorsed it, and folding outside material into an on-screen mystery without flagging the switch is exactly the move that turns an honest video into a misleading one. The same goes for Dan Harmon's occasional loose speculation about Mr. Poopybutthole species in interviews over the years. A creator thinking out loud about a character is not the same thing as that character's canon origin being confirmed, and treating the two as equivalent would hand you a false sense of certainty about something the show has worked hard to keep honestly open. I bring this up not to lecture, but because I think it is actually one of the more interesting things about how this particular fandom operates. A story this willing to leave real gaps creates a kind of vacuum, and audiences do not love vacuums, so all sorts of material rushes in to fill them. Fan theories, offhand creator comments, tie-in media that may or may not have ever been intended as binding. Most of that material is fun, and some of it is honestly well argued, but almost none of it carries the same weight as something the actual show puts on screen. And conflating the two is, I think, a common way well-meaning fans end up spreading confident misinformation about a series this large and this many years deep. A night like this only works if it holds that line consistently, all the way through, even when a looser, more exciting-sounding claim was sitting right there and would have made for a punchier sentence. There is one more thread worth pulling on before we let the whole night wind down, and it goes back to the central finite curve, the boundary Evil Morty tore open when he escaped the Citadel. We spent real time earlier explaining what that boundary actually is, a curated slice of the multiverse the Ricks maintained specifically to guarantee their own supremacy inside it, and what it means that Evil Morty broke through to whatever lies beyond it. What I did not get into then, because it deserved its own separate moment, is just how enormous that open question actually is once you dwell on it. Every version of Rick and Morty, every version of this entire family, every mystery we have spent tonight working through exists inside that curated boundary. Nothing ever depicted, not one single episode, has taken place outside it. That means the wider multiverse Evil Morty escaped into is not simply unexplored territory the way a new planet or a new dimension inside the curve would be. It is a region the show's own internal logic was specifically designed to keep its characters, and by extension its audience, from ever having to think about. I should frame this plainly as exactly what it is, my own speculation rather than anything close to confirmed, but it is hard not to wonder what kind of story could even be told out there, in a stretch of reality where a Rick is not guaranteed to be the smartest thing in the room, where the rules that have governed every joke and every reveal since the first episode, without ever being stated outright, might simply stop applying. The show has not gone there yet. It may never go there. But it is, as of Evil Morty's escape, the largest unanswered question the series currently has sitting on the table, larger in scope than any single mystery we walk through tonight. And it did not even need its own episode to get established. It just needed a door, left open, at the edge of everything we already know how to explain. I want to close with something a little more personal than a specific reveal or a specific episode, because putting a night like this together, tracing every one of these threads back to its first appearance and forward to wherever it currently stands, changes how the whole show sits in your head afterward. And I think that shift is worth describing honestly rather than leaving it implied. Watching Rick and Morty casually, the way most people first encounter it, the mysteries mostly register as texture, strange details that make an episode feel a little richer without demanding much follow-through. Assembling them deliberately, in order, across the entire run the way we have done tonight, turns that texture into something closer to a skeleton, A structure holding up a decade of episodes that otherwise look, on the surface, like a loosely connected pile of jokes about interdimensional cable and a rotating cast of disposable side characters. Once you can see that skeleton, it is difficult to watch even the silliest, most disposable-seeming episode the same way again, because you start noticing how often something small and unremarkable gets planted that will not matter for another 2 or 3 years, tucked into a scene that is, on first viewing, mostly there to make you laugh. I do not think that changes what kind of show Rick and Morty is. It is still, first and always, a very funny, very cruel, very strange piece of television, built to make you laugh at things you probably should not be laughing at. But knowing the shape of everything it is building underneath that surface, without a score cue or a dramatic pause to ever flag it, makes it feel less like a machine for generating jokes and more like a long, patient argument about grief and identity and family that occasionally, generously, remembers to also be extremely funny. I am not sure which version, the surface or the skeleton, is the truer one. I suspect the honest answer is that they were never actually separate to begin with, and that the trick being pulled for over a decade now is convincing you they were. There is one small, almost funny irony worth naming before we actually close, because it has been sitting under this entire video without me pointing at it directly. A story this fixated on originals and copies, on which version of a person actually counts, has now had its mysteries collected, cross-referenced, and narrated back to you by someone who was not in the writer's room for any of it, working entirely from what the show itself chose to put on screen and what the wiki built out of that same material afterward. This video is, in its own small way, a kind of replacement dimension of its own, a version of the story assembled after the fact, close to the original but never quite identical to sitting down and watching every one of the episodes yourself, in order across however many years it actually took you the first time. I do not think that makes it a lesser version of the story. If tonight has argued anything consistently, it is that the copy does not have to be lesser just because it arrived second. But it does mean that everything you heard tonight is best treated the way the show treats most of its own answers, held loosely, checked against the actual episodes whenever you get the chance to rewatch them, rather than accepted as some final, unquestionable word on a series that is, as of this recording, still actively writing new mysteries faster than anyone could ever finish cataloging the old ones. That open-endedness feels like the right note to actually rest on tonight, more than any specific conclusion about Rick or Diane, or either version of Beth could. We started this whole conversation on a garage that flickered between two versions of itself, unable, for years, to settle on which one was true. Most of what we have covered since then has been the slow, uneven work of deciding which of its own flickering images get to resolve into something solid, and which ones get to keep flickering indefinitely, permanently, on purpose. I do not think there is a lesson in that beyond the obvious one that some things get answered and some things do not, and that a family, even a fictional one built out of clones and cyborgs and duplicated old men, can keep functioning either way, as long as the people inside it keep choosing to stay. Rick and Morty has spent a very long time proving that particular point to anyone patient enough to sit with the whole shape of it, and tonight, hopefully, was long enough to actually feel that shape rather than just hear it described. One thing worth untangling on our way out, because it touches nearly every mystery we covered tonight without ever being stated as its own rule, is how differently death gets treated depending on which corner of this universe it happens in, and I think laying that pattern out plainly tells you something about which relationships the story actually considers load-bearing. Some deaths on this list are permanent in the fullest sense allowed, meaning no clone, no backup, no cyborg reconstruction ever brings the person back in any form. Diane's death holds that status absolutely, reinforced by the Omega device specifically to make sure it could never be undone by ordinary multiversal means. Rick Prime's death holds it too, beaten out by our Rick's own hands with every safety net evil Morty could strip away already gone. The Vindicators mostly hold that status as well, Vance Maximus and Alan Rails and Crocubot and the rest. Gone in that one chaotic episode and never brought back inside the mainline continuity, whatever a separate prequel might show you about an earlier point in one of their lives. Then there is a second category, the reversible deaths, and Bird Person is the clearest example ever built around this idea. Shot at his own wedding, rebuilt as a cyborg, shut down rather than killed a second time, and eventually alive again in some form never fully explained to us. Mr. Poopybutthole survives being shot early on, though that was never really presented as a serious brush with permanent death in the first place. More a running joke about how much punishment this one character can absorb and keep smiling through. Even the Citadel of Ricks, destroyed twice across the run, gets treated less like a permanent grave, and more like something that simply comes back, changed, rebuilt out of whatever survives, the way Birdperson himself keeps getting rebuilt out of whatever survives him. What strikes me, setting those two categories side by side, is that the deaths treated as absolutely final are, almost without exception, the ones tied directly to Rick's inner circle, the handful of relationships this entire video has kept circling back to all night. Diane, Rick Prime, in his own twisted way a kind of dark mirror of Rick himself. The people Rick specifically failed to protect through his own carelessness, like the Vindicators, whose deaths never get softened with a resurrection, precisely because softening them would let Rick off the hook for the specific gauntlet he built. Meanwhile, the deaths that do get walked back, Birdpersons especially, tend to belong to people the story has decided it is not finished with yet, people whose arc still has more to say even after their body technically stops working. That is not a hard and fast law ever stated out loud. It is closer to something you only notice by holding each of these threads up against all the others, the way tonight forced us to, and once you notice it, it becomes a fairly reliable guide to which characters are actually being protected from a real final ending, and which ones can be let go of for good, once and completely, no matter how much the loss costs the people left behind. There is one last craft observation I want to leave you with, because it explains something about why these mysteries feel the way they feel rather than just what they contain. Rick and Morty almost never uses a traditional flashback to deliver its biggest reveals. Think back across everything we covered tonight. The garage memory arrives as a brain scan, projected and witnessed in the present tense by characters standing right there in the room with it, not as a soft focus cutaway signaling the past. Rick Prime's full identity arrives through present tense confrontation rather than an extended flashback sequence explaining his whole history. Beth's clone status arrives as a piece of dialogue, delivered in the room, in the moment, rather than a memory sequence showing us the actual cloning as it happened years earlier. Even Birdperson's whole strange path from death to cyborg to shutdown to fatherhood gets delivered almost entirely through present tense updates rather than a single tidy, retrospective episode walking us through it in order. I think that choice matters more than it looks like it should. A flashback tells its audience, structurally, that the past is a separate, sealed compartment, a place you visit briefly before returning to the real, ongoing story. Rick and Morty's preference for present tense reveals refuses that separation entirely. The past here is not a place you visit. It is simply still happening, still active, still capable of walking into the room and changing what a character does next. The way Rick Prime's history walks directly into Rick's present the moment evil Morty disarms him. The way Diane's death walks directly into a Denny's bathroom the moment a fear hole decides to use her as bait. Grief and history in these hands are not backstory. They are current events that simply happen to have started a long time ago, and I think that is the real reason so many of these reveals hit as hard as they do. You are never being told about the past. You are watching it arrive, late, into a present that was never as separate from it as anyone on screen wanted to believe. I think if you have made it this far into the night, you probably already understand why a show built this way is such a strange, comfortable thing to fall asleep to. There is no cliffhanger tonight demanding you stay awake for the next installment, no ticking clock insisting you need to know right now. Most of what we have gone through together has been sitting there, unresolved, for years, in some cases for the entire lifespan of the show, and it will still be sitting there tomorrow and next week exactly as open as it is right now. That is, in its own strange way, a kind of permission. You do not have to hold any of this. You can let it go, let your eyes close, let the specific details of Rick Prime's motive or the exact wording of a talking cat's one line of dialogue drift out of focus, because none of it is going anywhere. The mysteries will keep waiting, patiently, the same way this show has waited on most of them for over a decade already. There is something tender about how much of this list comes down to family when you step back far enough from the multiverse mechanics and the eye patches and the Omega-class weapons. A father who could not tell his daughter the truth about the family she came from. A mother choosing, alongside her own clone, not to fight over which of them gets to be called real. A grandfather who spent decades pretending a bombing never happened because admitting it had happened meant admitting how much he had lost. A boy who discovered that his greatest fear was never a monster, just the specific, ordinary terror of being left behind by the one adult who was supposed to keep showing up for him. None of that requires a spaceship or a portal gun to understand. It is just what it looks like when people who love each other imperfectly keep trying anyway, dressed up, in this particular case, in enough absurdity and cruelty and cosmic scale that it takes a while to notice how plainly human all of it actually is underneath. I think that is part of why the show has lasted as long as it has, and why it will probably keep mattering to people long after whatever season is currently airing wraps up and the next one begins. Shows about ideas eventually run out of new ideas. Shows about a family, even one this strange, this fractured, this willing to clone itself and blow up its own government twice, and let its members die and come back changed, tend to have more room to keep going because the actual engine underneath all the science fiction was never really the science. It was watching these particular, damaged, funny, oddly tender people keep choosing each other, imperfectly, across more mysteries than any one of them could ever fully explain to the others, let alone to us. That is the part no volume of new mysteries could ever really replace, and I suspect it is what keeps pulling people back long after they have lost track of the exact plot. Whatever eventually gets answered and whatever gets held back, on principle, forever, that part, the choosing, seems unlikely to change. Rick and Morty has been strange and cruel and surprisingly gentle for a very long time now, long enough that entire mysteries have been born, aged, and finally resolved within its runtime while a whole generation of viewers grew up alongside it. And it does not appear to be finished yet, with more seasons already ordered beyond what any of us have seen, and no sign the writers have run out of small, dark rooms to hide their biggest reveals inside. I do not know which Beth is real, and I never will, and neither will Rick, and I have made my peace with that the same way the show clearly wants its audience to. I do not know exactly what waits for evil Morty on the other side of an arrest he has never been handed before. I do not know what Mr. Poopybutthole actually is, and at this point, I would almost be disappointed if I ever found out. What I do know is that a show willing to sit inside all of that uncertainty for over a decade, without flinching, without over-explaining, without ever quite letting its audience off the hook of having to wonder, has earned the kind of loyalty it clearly still has, all these years and all these unanswered questions later. There is a particular kind of comfort, I think, in spending a night like this one with a show that has never once pretended to have all the answers, especially set against how much of everything else in life quietly demands the opposite from you, without ever saying so out loud: certainty, resolution, a clean explanation delivered on schedule. Rick and Morty simply does not work that way and has never claimed to, and there is something restorative about handing yourself over for a few hours to a story entirely at peace with not knowing. You do not have to solve anything tonight. You do not have to remember which Beth is which, or what the cat saw, or whether evil Morty's arrest holds. You just have to let the show, and this long look back through everything it has built, wash over you the way it was always going to, whether you were taking notes or not. If you are still awake, thank you for staying with me through all of it. Every reveal and every dead end and every question this show has decided you will simply never get to close. If you have already drifted off somewhere around the Citadel, or the cat, or Bird Person's strange, quiet second life, or Unity's unanswered doubt, that is exactly what this was built for, and I hope it did its job gently. Rick and Morty will still be here tomorrow, still asking most of the same questions, still refusing to answer more of them than it answers, and there's something oddly restful, oddly kind even, about a show that has never once pretended it owes you certainty. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.